Hey guys, welcome back. Today's concept is absolutely insane. What if Naruto was the reincarnation of Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage? Think about it, Tobirama invented flying thunder god, shadow clones, and basically designed all of Konoha's systems. Now imagine that strategic genius reincarnated into Naruto with the Nine Tails chakra. We follow Naruto as he suddenly starts remembering techniques he never learned, struggling between Tobirama's pragmatic approach and his own idealistic nature, all while using OP jutsu that blow everyone's minds. Smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Let's dive into this masterpiece. The medical tent buzzed with quiet efficiency as Medic Nin tended to the wounded from the Chunin exam preliminaries. Naruto lay unconscious on a narrow cot, his breathing steady but shallow after his grueling match against Neji Hyuga. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canvas walls, casting long shadows across his peaceful face. But his mind was anything but peaceful. Water, always water. The young man's hands moved with practiced precision, weaving signs faster than the eye could follow. 23 hand seals in 3 seconds. The massive lake responded to his call, rising like a living thing, spiraling upward in defiance of gravity itself. Water release. Great waterfall technique. The enemy ninja scattered, but it was too late. The torrential cascade crashed down with the force of a natural disaster, reshaping the very landscape. Villages could be built or destroyed with such power. The responsibility of it all. Naruto's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air in the medical tent. That dream, it had felt more real than any dream he'd ever experienced. He could still feel the phantom sensation of chakra flowing through pathways he didn't remember learning about, could still taste the metallic tang of complex jutsu on his tongue. Finally awake, Naruto turned his head to see Shikamaru lounging in a nearby chair, his eyes closed but clearly alert. You were muttering something about water techniques. Weird, considering you can barely walk on water without falling flat on your face. Ha ha, very funny, Naruto said, but his voice came out hoarse and uncertain. He sat up slowly, his body protesting every movement. The fight with Neji had taken more out of him than he'd realized, but that wasn't what bothered him. Something felt different, wrong, like he was wearing someone else's clothes that almost fit but not quite. How long was I out? About 4 hours, Shikamaru replied, opening one eye to study him. Kakashi-sensei checked on you twice, said to tell him when you woke up. Naruto nodded absently, his mind still reeling from the vivid images that had filled his unconscious hours. The man in his dream, tall, pale, with stark white hair and red eyes, had felt familiar in a way that made no sense. Naruto had never seen him before, yet he could recall with perfect clarity the weight of the elaborate armor the man wore, the way his mouth set in a perpetual frown of concentration. Focus, Tobirama. The village needs these defenses completed before the next full moon. The voice echoed in his memory, belonging to an older man with long, dark hair and kind eyes, but that was impossible. Naruto didn't know anyone like that, didn't know anyone named Tobirama. You look like you've seen a ghost, Shikamaru observed. What a drag, don't tell me you're getting all philosophical because you want to fight. Before Naruto could respond, the tent flap opened and Kakashi stepped inside, his visible eye crinkling in what might have been relief or concern. It was impossible to tell with his mask. Ah, Naruto, good you're awake, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a really angry Neji, Naruto said, attempting his usual grin. But even as he spoke, more fragments of that strange dream flickered through his mind. Complex ceiling arrays drawn with mathematical precision. Political discussions about clan placement within the village. The careful balance required to maintain peace between proud, powerful families. Why would he dream about things like that? He could barely balance his own budget, let alone understand village politics. Well, that's to be expected, Kakashi said, moving closer to examine him. You pushed yourself pretty hard out there. That new technique you used, where did you learn it? Naruto blinked, confused. New technique, I just did the usual stuff. Shadow clones, Rasengan. Kakashi's visible eyebrow rose. Naruto, you created a whirlpool of chakra-enhanced water in the middle of your match, in a completely dry arena. Most genin can't even perform basic water release without a water source, let alone manifest one from nothing. I did what? Naruto's voice came out as a squeak. That was impossible. He'd never learned any water techniques, had barely managed to understand the basics of chakra nature transformation. Yet even as he protested, another memory surfaced, not from the dream this time, but from the fight itself. The moment when Neji had trapped him in the 8 trigrams 64 palms formation. The desperate need for escape, for something that could break through the Hyuga's defenses. And then, as natural as breathing, his hands had moved through a sequence of signs he'd never learned. Water release, water encampment wall. The technique had erupted from the ground beneath his feet, a defensive barrier that had given him the opening he needed to land his final attack. I remember, Naruto said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't understand how. It was like my body knew what to do even though my brain didn't. Kakashi and Shikamaru exchanged glances. In the weighted silence that followed, Naruto became acutely aware of other things that felt off. His posture, for one, he was sitting straighter than usual, his hands clasped in his lap in a formal manner that felt both foreign and natural. His mind felt sharper too, like a fog had been lifted, and he could see patterns and connections that had been invisible before. The Nine Tails chakra network integrates poorly with traditional water release techniques. You'll need to modify the standard approach, compress the chakra differently. The thought had appeared fully formed in his head, complete with technical understanding he definitely didn't possess 5 hours ago. Kakashi-sensei, he said carefully, has anything like this ever happened before, someone just knowing techniques they never learned? It's rare, Kakashi admitted, his tone thoughtful, but not unheard of. Some ninja have been known to spontaneously manifest abilities during moments of extreme stress. Your fight with Neji certainly qualified. But even as his teacher spoke, Naruto could see the concern in Kakashi's eye. This wasn't just stress-induced ability manifestation. This was something else entirely. Over the next few days, the strange episodes continued. During a routine D-rank mission to help with village reconstruction, Naruto found himself automatically calculating optimal guard rotations and identifying security vulnerabilities in ways that made Kakashi pause mid-sentence. When Sakura mentioned struggling with a theoretical exercise about chakra flow in medical ninjutsu, Naruto had rattled off a complex explanation involving chakra pathway mapping that left even their sensei looking impressed and confused. The dreams persisted too, growing more vivid and detailed each night. He saw the white-haired man, Tobirama, working tirelessly in what looked like an early version of Konoha. Fewer buildings, more trees, and a constant undercurrent of tension that spoke of a village still finding its identity. In these dreams, Naruto wasn't an observer but a participant, feeling the weight of decisions that could affect thousands of lives. The Uchiha compound should be placed here, Dream Tobirama decided, pointing to a location on the eastern edge of the village. Close enough to be part of the community, but positioned to allow for easy monitoring of their activities. Even in sleep, Naruto felt uncomfortable with the calculating nature of that decision. It seemed wrong to plan an entire clan's living situation around the assumption that they might need to be watched. But at the same time, he understood the reasoning with a clarity that frightened him. It was during a training session with Team 7 that everything came to a head. They were working on combination attacks in Training Ground 7, the familiar clearing where they'd spent countless hours honing their skills. Kakashi had set up a series of targets and obstacles, challenging them to work together to neutralize threats while protecting civilian mannequins scattered throughout the area. Remember, Kakashi called out, real missions rarely give you the luxury of fighting one-on-one. You need to think tactically, consider your teammates' abilities, and he was cut off by the sound of explosive tags detonating somewhere in the distance. The ground shook and smoke began to rise from the direction of the village center. What was that? Sakura asked, her medical training already making her scan for injuries among their group. Kakashi's expression grew grim as he pulled out a small communication device. The message he received made his visible eye widen in alarm. Invasion, he said tersely. Orchimaru's forces are attacking the village during the 3rd Hokage's match with the 4th Kazekage. We need to split up, Naruto interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to stare at him. Sakura should head to the hospital district. They'll need every medic they can get. Sasuke should support the Jonin fighting on the eastern perimeter where the main assault is focused. Kakashi-sensei, you need to get to the Hokage as quickly as possible. The words had come out automatically, accompanied by a tactical analysis that had assessed the village's defensive capabilities, likely enemy approaches, and optimal resource allocation in the space of seconds. And what about you? Kakashi asked, his tone carefully neutral. I'll handle civilian evacuation in the residential districts, Naruto said, then paused as another piece of strategic knowledge surfaced. The underground evacuation routes that connect to the old mine shafts will be the safest. I'll guide people there. Silence stretched between them. Naruto had never shown this kind of tactical thinking before, had never even known about the underground evacuation routes that were classified information available only to Chunin and above. "How do you know about those roots?" Sasuke demanded. Naruto opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. How did he know? The information was as clear in his mind as his own name, complete with detailed maps and access codes. "But that was impossible. Because I designed them," whispered a voice in the back of his mind that sounded like his own but felt ancient. "Every tunnel, every checkpoint, every emergency protocol. I built this village's defenses from the ground up." Before anyone could question him further, another explosion echoed across the village, this one much closer. Through the trees, they could see ninja in unfamiliar uniforms engaging Konoha forces. "We'll sort this out later," Kakashi decided. "For now, we follow Naruto's plan. Everyone stay safe and try to regroup at the Hokage Tower when the immediate threat is dealt with." They scattered in different directions, but Naruto found himself hesitating at the edge of the training ground. Something was pulling at him, a sense of urgency that went beyond the current crisis. His feet began moving of their own accord, carrying him not toward the residential districts as he'd claimed, but toward the Hokage Tower where he knew the real battle was taking place. Orchimaru, the ancient voice in his mind, hissed with recognition and loathing. "I should have killed him when I had the chance, but that made no sense." Naruto had never met Orochimaru before, had only heard stories about the legendary Sannin who'd abandoned the village years ago. Yet as he ran through the village streets, dodging falling debris and guiding panicked civilians to safety with an efficiency that surprised even him, he felt a personal animosity toward the snake ninja that seemed to stretch back decades. The four purple flames formation came into view as he reached the rooftop area where the Hokage's battle was taking place. The massive barrier crackled with malevolent energy, trapping the third Hokage inside with his opponents. Naruto's hands instinctively moved to the weapon's pouch at his waist, his fingers finding a strange three-pronged kunai that he didn't remember placing there. Flying Thunder God kunai his mind supplied automatically. But how? Without conscious thought, his hand whipped forward, launching the special kunai toward a group of sound ninja who were advancing on some injured Konoha defenders near the base of the building. The kunai embedded itself in the wall behind them, and Naruto felt a strange tingling sensation run through his chakra network. And then he was there. One moment he'd been standing on a distant rooftop, the next he was in the middle of the enemy formation, moving with fluid grace through attacks that seemed to unfold in slow motion. His body knew techniques he'd never learned, combinations of speed and precision that left his opponents sprawled unconscious before they could react. "Impossible," one of the sound ninja gasped before Naruto's precisely aimed strike dropped him as well. But it wasn't impossible, Naruto realized with growing wonder and terror. It was Flying Thunder God, the technique that had made the fourth Hokage legendary. The technique that, according to the memories now flowing freely through his mind, had been invented by someone else entirely. "My technique," the ancient voice confirmed with satisfaction, though Minato certainly made good use of it. As the immediate threat was neutralized, Naruto found himself staring at his own hands in shock. This wasn't just muscle memory or stress-induced ability manifestation. This was something far more profound and disturbing. He was remembering a life that wasn't his own. Skills that belonged to a man who had died decades before Naruto was born, knowledge of village secrets that should have been lost to time. "The second Hokage," he whispered, the name coming to his lips unbidden. "Tobirama Senju." The memories crashed over him then like a tidal wave, fragments of another existence bleeding into his consciousness. A lifetime of service to Konoha, of difficult decisions made for the greater good, of techniques created and students trained and enemies faced. A legacy of pragmatism and sacrifice that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Above him, the barrier containing the third Hokage flickered as the old man's battle reached its climax. Naruto could sense the massive chakra expenditure taking place within, could feel his surrogate grandfather giving everything he had to protect the village one last time. "Just as I did," the voice of Tobirama murmured in his mind. "Just as all Hokage must in the end." Naruto closed his eyes, feeling the weight of inherited memories settling over him like a mantle he wasn't sure he was ready to wear. When he opened them again, his gaze held a depth and understanding that hadn't been there that morning. The invasion of Konoha was far from over, but something fundamental had changed in Naruto Uzumaki. He was no longer just a hyperactive genin with dreams of becoming Hokage. He was the inheritor of a legacy he was only beginning to understand, carrying within him the accumulated wisdom and burden of one of the village's greatest leaders. As he prepared to rejoin the battle, one thought echoed through both sets of memories that now resided in his mind. The village must be protected, no matter the cost. The question that remained was whether Naruto could honor that duty while still remaining true to himself. Only time would tell if the optimistic boy who believed in saving everyone could coexist with the pragmatic spirit of the man who had helped build Konoha's foundations. But for now, there was a battle to fight and a village to save. Everything else could wait until the immediate crisis passed. With renewed determination and borrowed expertise, Naruto launched himself back into the fray, ready to protect his home with the combined strength of 2 lifetimes. The aftermath of Orochimaru's invasion left Konoha scarred but standing. Smoke still rose from damaged buildings as the village's defenders worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded and repair what could be salvaged. In the 3 days since the attack, Naruto had barely slept, his mind churning with memories that didn't belong to him and questions that seemed to have no answers. He sat alone on the steps of the memorial stone, staring at the names carved into its surface with an intensity that would have surprised anyone who knew him. But then again, the Naruto who had fought Neji in the preliminaries felt like a different person entirely, someone simpler, someone who didn't carry the weight of another lifetime's worth of regrets and difficult decisions. Uchiha Kagami, his eyes lingered on one name in particular. I should have seen the signs. Should have done more to bridge the gap between his clan and the village. The thought came unbidden, accompanied by a flash of memory that felt as real as his own experiences. A young Uchiha with kind eyes and unwavering loyalty, cut down in his prime while serving the village he loved. Tobirama's student, Tobirama's failure to protect. Naruto, the quiet voice made him jump, his hand instinctively moving toward a weapon that wasn't there. He turned to see the 3rd Hokage approaching, his aged face marked by exhaustion and something that might have been understanding. "Hokage Jaisan," Naruto said, then paused. The casual familiarity felt wrong somehow, overlaid as it was with memories of formal meetings and political discussions that had never happened. At least, not in this lifetime. "Walk with me," Hiruzen said simply, settling beside him on the steps. "There are things we need to discuss." They made their way through the village in comfortable silence, past reconstruction crews and memorial services, past families reuniting and others mourning their losses. Naruto found himself cataloging the damage with an analytical eye that was entirely foreign to his usual approach. 17 buildings in the Eastern District would need complete reconstruction. The hospital was overcrowded but functional. The academy had suffered minimal damage, which was fortunate. The children were always the priority. "Always the children," echoed a voice in his mind that sounded like his own but carried decades of experience. "The future of the village rests with them." "You've been thinking like him," Hiruzen observed quietly as they reached his office in the damaged but still functional Hokage Tower. Naruto started, then realized there was no point in denying what was becoming increasingly obvious. "How long have you known?" "I suspected something was different during the invasion," Hiruzen admitted, settling behind his desk with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. "When you used Flying Thunder God to save those civilians, I knew for certain. That technique died with the 4th Hokage, or so I thought." "But it didn't," Naruto said slowly. "It was never Minato-sensei's technique to begin with." The slip was telling. He'd never referred to the 4th Hokage as sensei before, had never known him personally. But in his inherited memories, Minato had been a brilliant student, one of the few who had truly mastered the intricacies of space-time ninjutsu. Hiruzen's eyes sharpened. "You remember then, not just the techniques but the relationships, the history." "More each day," Naruto admitted, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's like someone else is living in my head, but it's still me, you know. I can remember learning to walk, but I also remember designing the village's sewer system. I know what ramen tastes like, but I also know the exact chakra ratios needed for water release." "Great waterfall technique." "Reincarnation," Hiruzen said, the word carrying the weight of certainty. "Not possession or mental influence, but true reincarnation. Your soul is the same soul that once belonged to my sensei, Tobirama Senju." Hearing it stated so plainly should have been shocking, but instead Naruto felt only a strange sense of relief. Finally, someone else knew. Finally, he wasn't carrying this burden alone. "How is that possible?" he asked. "I'm not entirely certain," Hiruzen admitted. "There are theories about souls being drawn to unfinished business, about the will of fire creating connections that transcend death. What I do know is that you are not the first. There have been others." Hashirama believed that Asura and Indra, the sons of the Sage of Six Paths, had been reincarnating for generations. Madara and Hashirama themselves were thought to be reincarnations, locked in an eternal cycle of conflict and friendship. Hiruzen leaned forward, his expression grave. If that's true, then your connection to Sasuke may be more complex than simple friendship. The implications hit Naruto like a physical blow. Sasuke, his best friend, his rival, the Uchiha boy shows promise, whispered Tobirama's voice in his memory. But the Sharingan breeds a particular kind of madness. Isolation, paranoia, they must be watched. No, Naruto said aloud, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. I won't think of him like that. Sasuke is my friend, not some threat to be monitored. And that, Hiruzen said with something that might have been approval, is how I know you're still you, Naruto. Tobirama was many things, brilliant, dedicated, fiercely loyal to Konoha, but he never quite learned to see past clan prejudices to the individuals beneath. Naruto felt a flash of indignation on behalf of his past self, then caught himself. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, losing himself in someone else's personality and beliefs. Tell me about him, he said instead. About Tobirama, I have the memories, but they're fragmented. Incomplete. Hiruzen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal memory and deep respect. He was the most brilliant tactical mind I ever knew. Where Hashirama inspired through charisma and strength, Tobirama built through planning and preparation. Most of the village's infrastructure, its governmental systems, even the academy where young ninja are trained, all of it came from his designs. Images flashed through Naruto's mind as Hiruzen spoke, memories crystallizing into focus. Long nights spent over architectural plans, heated debates with the village council. The delicate balance required to integrate dozens of different clans into a single functioning community. He created the ranks of Chunin and Jonin to establish clear hierarchies and advancement paths, Hiruzen continued. He designed the mission system, the payment structures, the protocols for information security. In many ways, he built the foundation upon which all modern ninja villages operate. And the jutsu? Naruto asked, though he was already remembering. Shadow clone technique, flying thunder god, impure world reincarnation, techniques that had changed the course of ninja history. Revolutionary, Hiruzen said simply. He approached ninjutsu like a science, breaking down techniques to their component parts and rebuilding them more efficiently. The shadow clone technique alone has probably saved more ninja lives than any medical jutsu ever developed. Naruto nodded, remembering the painstaking process of developing that technique. The need for a training method that could accelerate learning while providing combat applications. The careful balance of chakra distribution required to make the clones viable without exhausting the user. But he wasn't perfect, Hiruzen added, his tone growing more serious. His policies regarding the Uchiha clan, well-intentioned as they were, created the very isolation that eventually led to their downfall. He saw threats where none existed and created divisions that lasted generations. I was protecting the village, Tobirama's voice protested in Naruto's mind. The Sharingan's power combined with the curse of hatred made them dangerous. Oversight wasn't persecution, it was prudence. The internal argument that followed left Naruto dizzy. Part of him could see the logic in Tobirama's reasoning, could understand the fear that had driven those decisions. But a larger part, the part that was fundamentally Naruto, recoiled from the idea of judging an entire clan based on their bloodline. I can feel him, Naruto said quietly. His thoughts, his justifications. Sometimes it's hard to tell which opinions are mine and which are his. That will likely be the greatest challenge you face, Hiruzen said with sympathy. Tobirama was set in his ways, convinced of the righteousness of his decisions. But you have something he never had, the perspective that comes from growing up with an Uchiha as your closest friend. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Sasuke chose that moment to appear in the office doorway. His usually composed expression was marred by uncertainty and something that might have been hurt. Am I interrupting? He asked, but his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if he was. Not at all, Hiruzen said smoothly. I was just finishing my conversation with Naruto. I'll leave you two to talk. The Hokage departed with a meaningful look, leaving the two teammates alone in the office. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and growing distance. You've been avoiding us, Sasuke said finally, his dark eyes studying Naruto's face. Sakura's worried. So is Kakashi. I've been busy, Naruto replied, then winced at how inadequate that sounded. There's been a lot to deal with since the invasion. Like learning jutsu you've never trained for? Sasuke's Sharingan flickered to life, the Tamo spinning slowly. I saw you during the fight, Naruto. That wasn't just desperation or hidden talent. You moved like someone with years of experience, used techniques that should be impossible for a genin to know. The boy's eyes see too much, Tobirama's voice whispered. This is why the Sharingan is dangerous. It reveals secrets that are meant to stay hidden. Naruto pushed the voice aside with an effort. It's complicated. Then uncomplicate it, Sasuke demanded, stepping closer. We're supposed to be teammates, friends, but lately you feel like a stranger. The hurt in Sasuke's voice cut deeper than any kunai. This was exactly what Naruto had been afraid of, that his new knowledge and memories would cost him the relationships he valued most. You want the truth, Naruto said, meeting Sasuke's gaze directly. I don't fully understand it myself, but I've been remembering things from before I was born. Sasuke's Sharingan spun faster, analyzing, searching for deception. That's impossible. So is a dead last Genin using Flying Thunder God, Naruto pointed out. But I did it anyway. For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Sasuke's shoulders sagged slightly and the Sharingan faded. Are you still you? He asked quietly. The idiot who eats ramen for every meal and still believes he can save everyone. The question hit closer to home than Sasuke probably realized. Was he still himself? Could he be with another person's lifetime of memories influencing his thoughts and decisions? I'm trying to be, Naruto said honestly. But it's not easy. These memories, this knowledge, it changes how I see everything. Including, he stopped himself before he could say including you. That way lay madness and the destruction of the most important friendship in his life. Including what? Sasuke pressed. Including what it means to be Hokage, Naruto said instead, which was true enough. The responsibilities, the sacrifices required, it's not the simple dream I thought it was. Sasuke studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. As long as you're still planning to become Hokage, I guess you're still Naruto. Just don't shut us out completely, okay? Whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to face it alone. After Sasuke left, Naruto remained in the office, staring out the window at the village below. The conversation had gone better than he'd feared, but worse than he'd hoped. How could he explain that he was remembering the life of someone who had viewed Sasuke's entire clan with suspicion? How could he maintain their friendship while carrying the guilt of policies that had contributed to the Uchiha massacre? Focus on what matters, he told himself. Sasuke is my friend. That's more real than any inherited prejudice. But even as he made that resolution, another memory surfaced. Tobirama's final battle, facing impossible odds against the Gold and Silver brothers. The desperate gambit that had saved his students but cost him his life. The memory was more vivid than any before it, accompanied by physical sensations that made Naruto gasp. He could feel the weight of armor on his shoulders, the burn of chakra depletion, the grim determination that had driven him to sacrifice everything for the village's future. You will be the third Hokage, Sarutobi, lead them well. But sensei, this is not a request, Hiruzen. The village needs strong leadership and you are the strongest among them. Protect Konoha. Protect the will of fire. The memory faded, leaving Naruto shaken. He understood now why these recollections were becoming clearer. Tobirama's final act had been one of ultimate sacrifice for the village, and that deed had somehow anchored his soul to Konoha itself. His reincarnation wasn't random, it was purposeful, connected to threats that were only now beginning to manifest. Wanting to clear his head, Naruto made his way to the training ground where he'd first learned to walk on water. The familiar space should have been comforting, but instead, he found his analytical mind cataloging inefficiencies in the layout and design. This area would be more effective with targets positioned at varying elevations, he thought automatically. And the water feature could be expanded to allow for more complex jutsu practice. Frustrated with his inability to stop thinking like Tobirama, Naruto decided to work off his tension through training. He began with basic kata, but even these simple movements felt different now. His stances were more precise, his transitions smoother, his breathing more controlled. Without conscious thought, he began incorporating elements from techniques he'd never learned. His movements flowed like water, then struck like lightning. When he threw a practice kunai, his hand moved through the preliminary motions of Flying Thunder God before he caught himself. Interesting, he murmured, studying his own hand with curiosity. I wonder. Before he could second-guess himself, Naruto began weaving hand seals for a technique he'd never attempted before. The movements felt natural muscle memory guiding him through a complex sequence that would have taken most ninja years to master. Water release, water severing wave. The technique erupted from his mouth as a high-pressure stream of water, cutting through a tree trunk like a blade through paper. But something was wrong. The jutsu was more powerful than it should have been, crackling with energy that hadn't been part of the original design. Naruto stared in amazement as the water continued to glow with faint blue light, realizing what had happened. He hadn't just reproduced Tobirama's technique, he'd improved it. instinctively combining wind chakra nature transformation with the traditional water release. The result was a jutsu that was both familiar and entirely new. This is what reincarnation truly means, he realized with growing wonder, not just inheriting the past but building upon it, making it better. For the first time since the memories had begun, Naruto felt genuinely excited rather than overwhelmed. He wasn't losing himself to Tobirama's legacy, he was adding his own innovations to it. The combination of Tobirama's technical knowledge and his own intuitive approach to jutsu development had created something neither could have achieved alone. As the sun set over Konoha, casting long shadows across the training ground, Naruto began to plan. He had the accumulated knowledge of one of the village's greatest innovators, combined with his own unique perspective and abilities. If he was careful, if he stayed true to himself while honoring the past, he might be able to help Konoha in ways that neither Naruto Uzumaki nor Tobirama Senju could have managed individually. The question was whether he could do so without losing the friendships and dreams that made him who he was. As he practiced his new technique late into the night, Naruto made a silent promise to both his past and future selves. He would find a way to honor Tobirama's legacy while staying true to his own values, even if it killed him. Again, the village must be protected, whispered the voice in his mind, and for the first time, Naruto found himself in complete agreement. But protection comes in many forms. Sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when not to use your power. As he walked home through the quiet streets of Konoha, Naruto felt the weight of 2 lifetimes settling on his shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but not an impossible one. He had friends to help him carry it, and a dream worth fighting for. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate task of being both Naruto Uzumaki and the inheritor of Tobirama Senju's legacy. Tonight, he would simply be a young ninja who had discovered that some knowledge came with a price, but that price didn't have to be paid in isolation. The will of fire burned bright within him, fueled by both ancient wisdom and youthful determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as himself, all of himself, past and present combined. The training ground on the outskirts of Konoha was scarred with craters and scorch marks, evidence of the intensive session that had been ongoing for the past 3 hours. Naruto stood in the center of the devastation, barely winded despite having just performed a series of techniques that should have left any genin exhausted. His breathing was controlled, his stance perfect, and his eyes held the calculating gleam that had become increasingly common over the past 2 weeks. Jiraiya crouched at the edge of the clearing, ostensibly taking notes in his research journal, but actually studying his newest student with growing unease. The boy, no young man now, there was nothing boyish about the way Naruto moved anymore, had just executed a flawless combination of wind and water techniques that had taken Jiraiya himself months to perfect. Interesting approach, Jiraiya said casually, though his grip on his pen betrayed his tension. Where did you learn to compress chakra like that? It's not a technique I've seen before. Naruto paused in his cooldown stretches, a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty crossing his features. It just seemed logical. If you reduce the chakra density in the initial formation while increasing the rotation speed, you get better penetration with less energy expenditure. The technical explanation rolled off Naruto's tongue with practiced ease, as if he'd been studying advanced chakra theory for years rather than weeks. Jiraiya made another note, this one genuine, too advanced, too precise. This isn't natural progression, this is like someone downloaded decades of experience directly into his brain. Let's try something different, Jiraiya said, standing and dusting off his pants. I want you to show me the Rasengan, not the way I taught it to your father, but the way it feels natural to you now. Naruto nodded and extended his palm. But instead of the usual lengthy formation process, his chakra began spinning immediately, forming the familiar blue sphere in seconds rather than the usual minute or two. More concerning still was the subtle variation in the technique's structure, microscopic adjustments that improved its stability and power output. Who taught you those modifications? Jiraiya asked bluntly. No one taught me, Naruto replied, then hesitated. It's more like remembering something I used to know but had forgotten. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense at all, Jiraiya thought grimly. But it does explain a few things. Over the past fortnight, reports had been filtering back to him about Naruto's behavior during the invasion. The use of advanced water techniques, the tactical brilliance that had saved dozens of civilian lives, the mysterious appearance of flying thunder god Kunai. Individually, these could be explained as stress-induced breakthroughs or hidden talent finally manifesting. Together, they painted a picture that was far more complex. Naruto, Jiraiya said carefully, I want you to tell me exactly what you remember about learning these techniques. Start from the beginning. The question seemed to hit Naruto like a physical blow. His controlled composure cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the uncertainty and fear he'd been hiding. I don't learn them, he admitted quietly. I just know them, like muscle memory from a dream I can't quite remember having. Sometimes I'll be in the middle of a technique and realize I'm doing things I've never been taught. Jiraiya felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories, legends really, about souls that carried memories across lifetimes. But those were supposed to be myths, cautionary tales about the dangers of forbidden jutsu like impure world reincarnation. These dreams, he pressed, do you remember anything specific about them? Faces, places, conversations? Naruto's expression grew distant, as if he were looking at something only he could see. There's this man. Tall, white hair, red eyes. He's always working on something, jutsu scrolls, architectural plans, meetings with people in formal robes, and Naruto struggled with the words. He's always watching, always analyzing. Like he sees threats everywhere. Red eyes, white hair, always analyzing. Jiraiya's blood ran cold. Those weren't the features of just any ninja, they were the distinctive traits of Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage. The man who had been his grand teacher's sensei, whose innovations had shaped modern ninja society, and whose policies regarding certain clans had created divisions that lasted generations. This man in your dreams, Jiraiya said slowly, does he have a name? Tobirama, Naruto whispered, and the name seemed to carry weight beyond simple syllables. His name is Tobirama and he was trying to protect something. The village, but also something more. An idea maybe. The confirmation sent a jolt through Jiraiya's system. This wasn't just advanced technique mastery or tactical brilliance, this was genuine reincarnation. Naruto was carrying the memories and instincts of one of Konoha's founding fathers, a man whose shadow still influenced village policy decades after his death. No wonder he's been acting strange. The kid's got the memories of the most paranoid genius in Konoha's history rattling around in his skull. Naruto, Jiraiya said gently, I think we need to have a very serious conversation, but not here. Too many ears in the village proper. Meet me at the old watchtower tonight after sunset. And don't tell anyone where you're going. As they parted ways, Jiraiya couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. Tobirama Senju had been many things. Brilliant, dedicated, fiercely protective of Konoha. But he'd also been deeply suspicious of anyone he perceived as a threat to village stability. If those instincts were bleeding into Naruto's personality. Meanwhile, Naruto made his way back toward the village center, but his route took him past the memorial stone where he'd been spending increasing amounts of time. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Sasuke was there, standing before the stone with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that looked eerily formal. You're late for team training, Sasuke said without turning around. Kakashi was looking for you. I was training with Jiraiya, Naruto replied, but even as he spoke, his analytical mind was cataloging details about Sasuke's stance, his breathing, the subtle tension in his shoulders. Agitated, something's bothering him, possibly related to clan matters. He always carries himself differently when thinking about his family. The observation came with clinical detachment that would have been completely foreign to the old Naruto. More disturbing still was the automatic follow-up analysis. Uchiha emotional volatility could be a security concern. Should monitor for signs of instability. Stop it, Naruto said aloud, causing Sasuke to turn toward him with a puzzled expression. Stop what? Nothing. Sorry, I was just... Naruto struggled to explain the internal war between his natural concern for his friend and the inherited suspicion that seemed to color every interaction now. How are you holding up since the invasion, I mean? Sasuke's dark eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity. I should be asking you that question. You're the one who's been acting like a completely different person. I'm still me, Naruto protested, but even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. How much of his current behavior was genuine Naruto, and how much was Tobirama's influence? Are you? Sasuke stepped closer, his sharing and flickering to life. Because the Naruto I know doesn't analyze everything like it's a potential threat. He doesn't hold back in training because he's calculating optimal force ratios. And he definitely doesn't look at me like I'm some kind of security risk. The accusation hit home because it was partially true. Naruto had been holding back, measuring his responses, treating even friendly conversations like potential intelligence-gathering opportunities. The realization made him feel sick. I'm not, he started, then stopped. Because he was doing exactly that, wasn't he? Even now, part of his mind was noting the way Sasuke's chakra signature had subtly shifted with emotional stress, cataloging it as potentially relevant information. The Uchiha boy is perceptive. Dangerous trait in combination with the Sharingan will need to adjust approach. There, Sasuke said coldly, that look, like you're solving an equation instead of talking to your friend. When did that start? Naruto wanted to explain, but how could he? How could he tell Sasuke that he was carrying the memories of a man who had helped design the very policies that isolated the Uchiha clan? How could he admit that every time he looked at his best friend now, part of him saw not Sasuke the individual, but Sasuke the Uchiha, inheritor of a bloodline that Tobirama had viewed with deep suspicion? It's complicated, he said lamely. Everything's complicated with you lately, Sasuke replied. But here's something simple, either you trust me enough to tell me what's really going on or you don't. Which is it? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Naruto opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again as another wave of inherited memories crashed over him. The Konoha Military Police Force. Established Meiji 3, Year of the Tiger, staffed exclusively by Uchiha clan members, ostensibly an honor recognition of their abilities and loyalty. Actually a containment strategy. Keep them busy with internal security matters. Monitor their activities. Ensure they remain focused on village affairs rather than external politics. It's a brilliant solution, Tobirama Sensei, young Hiruzen had said during one of their planning sessions. They get positions of authority and respect, and we get oversight of their clan activities. Brilliant and necessary, Tobirama had replied. The Sharingan breeds a particular kind of madness, Hiruzen. Love twisted into hate, loyalty corrupted by obsession. We must never forget that the Uchiha feel emotions more deeply than others, and that depth can become a weapon against us all. The memory was so vivid that for a moment, Naruto could smell the ink on the documents they'd been reviewing, could feel the weight of the decision they were making. A decision that had seemed reasonable at the time, necessary even, but which had ultimately contributed to the very isolation and resentment that led to the massacre. I have to go, Naruto said abruptly, backing away from Sasuke. I just remembered something I need to check on. He left before Sasuke could respond, practically fleeing toward the Hokage tower. The guilt was overwhelming, not just for his evasiveness with his friend, but for the inherited complicity in decisions that had shaped Sasuke's tragic history. The tower's archives were located in the basement levels, accessible to Chunin and above with proper authorization. Normally, Naruto would never have been allowed access to such classified materials. But normality had gone out the window the moment Tobirama's memories had started surfacing, and security protocols meant little when you remembered helping to write them. The guard at the archive entrance looked up with surprise as Naruto approached. Hey there, Naruto, what brings you down here? This isn't exactly your usual hangout spot. Research project, Naruto said with a casualness he didn't feel. Trying to understand some historical context for advanced jutsu development. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it wasn't the whole truth either. The guard seemed satisfied and waved him through, probably assuming that any genin who'd survived Orchimaru's invasion deserved some leeway. The archives were vast, filled with scrolls and documents dating back to Konoha's founding. But Naruto moved through them with purpose, his inherited memories guiding him to specific sections. Here were the village charter documents. There were the clan integration protocols, and hidden behind a filing cabinet in a section that officially didn't exist. Naruto's fingers found the hidden catch that opened a concealed compartment, revealing a collection of scrolls bound in water-resistant silk. Tobirama's personal research notes, the ones he'd kept separate from official records because they dealt with theories and contingencies that might be considered too dangerous for general knowledge. Advanced chakra manipulation techniques, theoretical applications, spatial displacement analysis, combat optimization studies, bloodline integration, protocols, security implications. The last scroll made Naruto's hands shake as he unrolled it. Page after page of analysis on various clan bloodlines, their strengths, weaknesses, and potential threat assessments. The Uchiha section was extensive, filled with observations about Sharingan evolution, emotional triggers, and recommended monitoring procedures. The curse of hatred appears to be hereditary, passed down through both bloodline and cultural transmission. Subjects displaying early signs of emotional volatility should be identified and provided with additional oversight. In extreme cases, isolation protocols may be necessary to prevent clan-wide contamination. Note, young Kagami shows exceptional resistance to typical Uchiha emotional patterns. Recommend continued observation and possible recruitment for sensitive missions. His loyalty to the village may serve as a template for future Uchiha integration strategies. Reading his past self's clinical assessment of what amounted to Sasuke's entire heritage made Naruto feel physically ill. These weren't the ravings of a madman, they were the careful, logical conclusions of a brilliant strategist who had observed patterns and drawn connections. But they were also the foundation for policies that had ultimately destroyed everything they were meant to protect. This is why, Naruto whispered to the empty archive room, this is why they were isolated, why they planned the coup. Why Itachi had to. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with horrible clarity. The Uchiha massacre hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the inevitable result of decades of systematic marginalization that began with Tobirama's well-intentioned but ultimately destructive policies. As if triggered by his emotional turmoil, another memory surfaced, this one more recent and far more traumatic. The night of the massacre, not viewed through the eyes of a survivor or a witness, but through a spiritual connection that transcended death. Tobirama's soul bound to Konoha itself, experiencing the ultimate failure of his policies. Streets running red with blood, families destroyed in minutes, the sound of children crying for parents who would never answer. And through it all, a young man with the same face as Sasuke, tears streaming down his cheeks as he carried out orders that would damn him forever. "Forgive me, Sasuke," Itachi whispered into the darkness. "This is the only way to save you." But even as he spoke, another voice echoed through the spiritual realm, Tobirama's voice, heavy with the weight of unintended consequences. "This is my fault. My policies, my prejudice, my failure to see the individuals behind the bloodline. I created the conditions that made this necessary." The vision was so intense that Naruto collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the combined anguish of witness, victim, and inadvertent architect. He understood now why his memories of Tobirama were becoming clearer. His soul was bound to Konoha not just by love, but by guilt, by the need to somehow atone for mistakes that had echoed across generations. "I won't let it happen again," Naruto promised, speaking to both his past self and the empty room. "I won't let suspicion and fear destroy what we're trying to protect." But even as he made the vow, he felt the weight of inherited instincts pushing back. Tobirama's analytical mind was already cataloging ways the massacre could have been prevented, most of which involved earlier intervention and more thorough monitoring of clan activities. The logic was seductive, practical, and utterly toxic to the relationships Naruto valued most. "You cannot save everyone," Tobirama's voice whispered in his mind. "Sometimes the needs of the many must outweigh the desires of the few. This is the burden of leadership, making decisions others cannot make, bearing guilt others cannot understand." "No," Naruto said aloud. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that created this mess in the first place." He carefully returned the scrolls to their hiding place and made his way back to street level, his mind churning with conflicting emotions and half-formed plans. The sun was beginning to set, painting Konoha's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the village, Sasuke was probably still waiting for an explanation that Naruto couldn't give him. Somewhere else, Jiraiya was preparing for a conversation that would change everything. And deep in the archives below, the documented fears and prejudices of a dead man waited to influence future decisions, just as they had for decades. The watchtower on Konoha's northern border was a relic from the village's early days, built during the period when attacks from rival nations were a constant threat. Now it served mainly as a reminder of less peaceful times, its weathered stones and rusted mechanisms speaking to the passage of years. Naruto arrived just as the last light was fading from the sky, his emotions still raw from his discoveries in the archives. Jiraiya was already waiting, leaning against the tower's base with his arms crossed and his expression unusually serious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jiraiya observed. "Something like that," Naruto replied. "I found some old research notes, Tobirama's personal files, they explained a lot." "About the Uchiha?" Naruto nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The weight of inherited guilt was almost unbearable. How could he continue his friendship with Sasuke knowing that his past self had helped create the conditions that led to his family's destruction? "Here's what I think is happening," Jiraiya said, settling onto a fallen log and gesturing for Naruto to join him. "Souls don't usually reincarnate with their memories intact. When it does happen, it's because something went unfinished, some responsibility or guilt that ties them to the world of the living. So I'm stuck with his memories because he couldn't let go?" "Not stuck," Jiraiya corrected. "Gifted with them, the question is what you do with that gift. You can let Tobirama's guilt and paranoia define you, or you can use his knowledge and experience to make better choices." Naruto considered this as he sat beside his sensei, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. He created the police force to spy on the Uchiha. He established policies that isolated them from the rest of the village. Every decision was logical, defensible, and ultimately destructive. And now you have the chance to do better, Jiraiya said simply. You know where those policies led, you understand the unintended consequences. More importantly, you know Sasuke as an individual, not just as a member of his clan. But what if Tobirama was right? The question tore itself from Naruto's throat before he could stop it. What if the Sharingan really does breed instability? What if my friendship with Sasuke is blinding me to legitimate concerns? Jiraiya was quiet for a long moment, studying the young man beside him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. I once knew an Uchiha named Fugaku, Sasuke's father. He was proud, sometimes stubborn, always passionate about protecting his family and clan. But he was also fair, honorable, and deeply loyal to Konoha. The policies that isolated his clan, that made him feel like a suspect in his own village, those policies created the very resentment and desperation that led to the coup attempt. Naruto felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. So the surveillance and suspicion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Exactly, Tobirama saw patterns and tried to control them, but his methods created new patterns that were far worse. You have the chance to break that cycle, but only if you trust your own judgment over inherited prejudice. As they talked, Naruto felt some of his internal conflict beginning to resolve. He would always carry Tobirama's memories and knowledge that was beyond his control. But he could choose which aspects of that legacy to embrace and which to reject. The technical knowledge, the strategic thinking, the innovations that had made Konoha stronger, those were gifts he could use to help his friends and protect his village. The prejudices, the paranoia, the tendency to see threats where none existed, those were burdens he could choose not to carry forward. Thank you, Naruto said as they prepared to part ways, for helping me understand. I was starting to think I was losing myself completely. You're not losing yourself, Jiraiya assured him. You're just gaining perspective. Use it wisely. As Naruto made his way back to the village, his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Tomorrow, he would find Sasuke and tell him as much of the truth as he safely could. He would work to repair the distance that had grown between them, not by hiding his changes, but by ensuring those changes served friendship rather than suspicion. The memories of Tobirama Senju would always be part of him now. But they would be tools in service of Naruto Uzumaki's dreams, not chains binding him to someone else's fears. The will of fire burned bright within him, but now it was tempered by wisdom, strengthened by understanding, and guided by the hard-won knowledge that the greatest threats to what you love often come from within. As he walked through Konoha's quiet streets, Naruto made a silent promise to both his past and future selves. He would honor Tobirama's legacy by learning from his mistakes, not by repeating them. The village slept peacefully around him, protected by walls and treaties and the dedication of its ninja. But the most important protection it had was the promise of a young man who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the techniques you inherit, but in the wisdom to know which ones should never be used. The news hit Konoha like a thunderbolt in the early hours of dawn. Sasuke Uchiha had defected, leaving behind only his forehead protector and a trail of unconscious guards who had tried to stop him. By the time the alarm was raised, he was already hours ahead of any pursuit, accompanied by 4 mysterious ninja whose chakra signatures were completely unfamiliar to the village's sensors. Naruto stood in the Hokage's office, still in his pajamas, as Sunnade delivered the briefing with grim efficiency. But even as she spoke, his enhanced analytical mind was already processing implications that the old Naruto would never have considered. Sound 4 formation, Orchimaru's operatives most likely. Curse Mark activation enables temporary power boosts but at significant physical cost. They'll need to stop periodically to allow Sasuke's body to adjust. Route analysis suggests they're heading toward the land of rice fields. Terrain advantages favor speed over stealth, indicating confidence in their ability to outfight pursuit rather than outmaneuver it. Sasuke's psychological state. Unstable, driven by revenge, susceptible to manipulation through promises of power. Classic Uchiha emotional pattern, love corrupted into hatred. The clinical assessment made him feel sick, but he couldn't stop the analytical process any more than he could stop breathing. This was what Tobirama's memories brought him, the ability to see patterns and strategic implications even in his most personal relationships. Naruto, Tsunade's sharp voice snapped him back to the present. I said, are you listening? Yes, Hokage-sama, he replied automatically, then caught himself using the formal address that felt natural now but would have seemed strange weeks ago. I understand. Retrieval mission, minimal casualties if possible, priority on bringing Sasuke back alive. Sunnade's eyes narrowed slightly at his formal tone, but she nodded. Shikamaru will lead the team. You'll be accompanied by Choji, Neji, and Kiba. Rock Lee is in the hospital, but he'll catch up if he can. Inadequate force composition, Tobirama's voice whispered in his mind. 5 genin against 4 curse mark users and potentially Orchimaru himself. This is a suicide mission disguised as a rescue operation. With respect, Hokage-sama, Naruto said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. That team composition is insufficient for the likely threat level. If Orochimaru is involved, we should wait for Jonin backup or at minimum include. Since when do you question mission parameters? Sunnade interrupted, but her tone was more curious than angry. Naruto paused, realizing he'd been thinking like a military strategist rather than a loyal friend desperate to save his teammate. The shift in perspective was so subtle he'd barely noticed it happening. Since I learned that sometimes good intentions aren't enough, he said quietly. But you're right, we can't wait for optimal conditions. Every minute we delay gives them more distance. 20 minutes later, the retrieval team was racing through the forests north of Konoha, following the trail left by Sasuke and his escorts. Shikamaru had deployed them in standard pursuit formation, but Naruto found himself automatically adjusting their positioning based on tactical considerations the others couldn't see. Kiba and Akamaru should take point. Their tracking abilities are superior, and the dog senses will provide early warning of ambushes. Neji should maintain overwatch position, elevated when possible to maximize Byakugan range. Choji in reserve, positioned to provide rapid support where needed. The formations he was envisioning were far more sophisticated than anything Genin would normally attempt, designed to minimize casualties while maximizing intelligence gathering. But implementing them would require explanations he couldn't give. Naruto, Shikamaru called back from his position at the front of the group, you're being unusually quiet. Got something on your mind? Just thinking about Sasuke, Naruto replied, which was true as far as it went. But his thoughts were colored by inherited memories of other defections, other pursuits, other young ninja who had chosen power over loyalty. Madara's departure from Konoha, the arguments with Hashirama, the growing resentment, the final confrontation at the Valley of the End. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The parallel was uncomfortable but undeniable. Another Uchiha, driven by grief and a hunger for power, abandoning everything for the promise of strength sufficient to achieve his goals. The pattern was so clear it might have been written in the textbooks Tobirama had never gotten around to writing. They covered ground quickly, but not quickly enough. By afternoon, they'd encountered the first obstacle, a massive two-headed dog that stood nearly 10 feet tall, guarding a narrow pass through the mountains. Behind it stood one of the Sound Four, a wild-haired ninja with an arrogant smile and chakra that felt wrong in ways Naruto couldn't quite articulate. Well, the Sound Ninja said, his voice carrying an odd echo. Little Konoha puppies come to fetch their lost toy. I'm Sakin, and this is as far as you go. The battle that followed was vicious and chaotic, exactly the kind of fight that favored raw power over tactical sophistication. But as Naruto watched his teammates struggle against an opponent who was clearly beyond their normal capabilities, something shifted in his perception. Curse mark, second stage. Chakra output increased by approximately 300%, but cellular damage accumulating rapidly. Estimated combat effectiveness window, 15 minutes before significant degradation. Dual personality manifestation suggests mental instability. Likely to become overconfident, create openings through excessive aggression, team cohesion breaking down. Kiba's injured, Choji's hesitating, Neji's burning through chakra too quickly. Without intervention, casualty probability exceeds 80%. The analytical assessment was delivered with cold precision, but it sparked something warmer in Naruto's core, the fierce protectiveness that had always defined him. His friends were in danger, and he had the knowledge to help them. The question was whether he could do so without revealing abilities that would raise uncomfortable questions. But as Sakin's transformed state began overwhelming their defenses, as Kiba fell with a sickening crunch of breaking bones, as Choji's hesitation nearly cost him his life, the question became moot. Naruto's hands moved through a sequence of seals that felt as natural as breathing muscle memory, guiding him through a technique he'd never been taught. Water release, exploding water colliding wave. The massive volume of water that erupted from his mouth would have been impossible for any genin to produce, requiring both exceptional chakra reserves and perfect nature transformation. But what made it truly shocking was the strategic precision with which it was deployed, not just as an attack, but as a battlefield manipulation that separated Saken from his summoned creature while creating optimal positioning for his teammates. "Neji, high ground to your left," Naruto called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a battlefield commander. "Choji, expansion jutsu, target the dog while it's disoriented. Shikamaru, shadow bind when I give the signal." His teammates responded automatically to the confidence in his voice, moving with coordinated precision that would have been impossible minutes before. But even as they fought, Naruto could see the questions in their eyes, the growing uncertainty about who he really was. "They're afraid of me," he realized with a stab of pain, "not the enemy, me." The thought was enough to shake his concentration, allowing Saken to break free of their coordinated assault and counterattack with renewed fury. In that moment of distraction, the Sound Ninja's claws raked across Naruto's chest, drawing blood and pain, but also something else, a deeper connection to the memories that had been surfacing gradually over the past weeks. Suddenly, Naruto wasn't just remembering Tobirama's techniques and knowledge. He was experiencing the second Hokage's emotions, his thought patterns, his fundamental worldview with crystal clarity. The shift was so complete it felt like drowning in someone else's consciousness. Combat effectiveness deteriorating, team morale compromised, enemy adapting to our strategies faster than anticipated, acceptable losses threshold approaching. Primary objective, neutralize immediate threat. Secondary objective, maintain operational security. Tertiary objective, minimize casualties among friendly forces. Recommendation, deploy lethal force authorization. Threat level justifies extreme measures. The thoughts arose with Tobirama's voice, cold and calculating and utterly logical. From that perspective, Saken wasn't a person with hopes and fears and people who would mourn his death. He was simply an obstacle to be removed with maximum efficiency. Naruto's hands began moving through the seals for Flying Thunder God, a technique that would allow him to appear behind Saken and end the fight with a single decisive strike. But as the jutsu began to activate, as he prepared to do what Tobirama would have done without hesitation, something stopped him. Sasuke's face, filled with the same cold calculation that now felt so natural. The memory of his friend walking away from everything that mattered, choosing power and revenge over bonds and loyalty. Was this how it started, with logical decisions that prioritized victory over humanity? "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few," Tobirama's voice whispered. "This is what leadership means, making the choices others cannot make." But even as the inherited wisdom pressed against his consciousness, Naruto's core nature reasserted itself. He wasn't Tobirama, wasn't bound by the second Hokage's fears and prejudices. He could be strategic without being ruthless, tactical without being heartless. Instead of the lethal finishing move, Naruto adjusted his technique, using Flying Thunder God for positioning rather than assassination. He appeared behind Saken not to kill, but to apply a sleeper hold with precisely calculated pressure that would render the Sound Ninja unconscious without permanent damage. "Surrender," he said simply as Saken's struggles weakened. "You've lost, but you don't have to die." The Sound Ninja's response was to trigger an explosive tag attached to his vest, a desperate gambit that would have killed them both if not for Naruto's enhanced reflexes. Flying Thunder God activated again, carrying him to safety while leaving Saken to face the consequences of his own desperation. When the smoke cleared, the enemy was down but alive, unconscious and injured but breathing. The massive summoned dog had dismissed itself, recognizing that its contractor was no longer capable of maintaining the technique. "How?" Shikamaru asked, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and concern. "How did you know those techniques?" "That coordination, that level of tactical thinking, it's not normal, Naruto." Before Naruto could answer, Neji's Byakugan suddenly activated, his pale eyes wide with alarm. Multiple chakra signatures approaching from the east, large group moving fast. The rescue became a running battle as more sound operatives materialized from the forest, forcing the Retrieval team to fight a series of delaying actions while pursuing their original quarry. But with each engagement, Naruto found himself slipping deeper into Tobirama's mindset, making decisions with cold efficiency that saved lives but cost him pieces of his own identity. By the time they reached the Valley of the End, he felt more like Tobirama Senju than Naruto Uzumaki. The transformation was so complete that when he saw Sasuke standing on Midoriya's statue, his first thought wasn't of friendship or loss, but of patterns and inevitabilities. Another Uchiha, another defection, another tragedy that could have been prevented with proper oversight and intervention. Sasuke had changed during his brief time with the Sound 4. The curse mark's influence was visible in his posture, his expression, the casual way he dismissed his former teammates as obstacles rather than friends. But more disturbing was the calculating coldness in his eyes, the same analytical detachment that Naruto had been fighting against in himself. "You came," Sasuke said, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once characterized their rivalry. "Good, I was hoping for the chance to demonstrate the gap between us one more time." "Sasuke," Naruto began, but the words felt strange in his mouth. How could he argue for bonds and friendship when his own thoughts had become so tactical and detached? Subject displays advanced curse mark integration. Chakra signature indicates recent power augmentation, likely through forbidden techniques. Emotional state suggests complete commitment to defection, rehabilitation probability minimal. Recommended approach: subdue through overwhelming force, minimize collateral damage, extract for interrogation and possible reconditioning. The clinical assessment arose automatically, but this time Naruto recognized it for what it was: Tobirama's response to a security threat, not a friend's concern for someone he cared about. The realization was enough to help him push back against the inherited mindset, to reclaim some measure of his own identity. "I'm not here to fight you," Naruto said, his voice carrying more of his natural warmth. "I'm here to bring you home." Sasuke's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Home? To what? A village that will always see me as a potential threat, a team that never understood what I needed. A friend who's become something else entirely." The last comment hit home because it was true. Naruto had become something else, someone else, and the change was visible to anyone who knew him well. The question was whether that transformation was permanent or if he could find a way back to himself. "You're right," Naruto admitted. "I have changed, but that doesn't mean I care about you any less." The battle that followed was unlike any fight Naruto had ever experienced. Not because of its intensity or the techniques involved, but because he found himself constantly torn between two different approaches to combat. Tobirama's strategic brilliance urged him to exploit Sasuke's emotional instability, to use psychological pressure and superior technique to achieve quick victory. But Naruto's heart demanded that he reach his friend, that he somehow break through the barriers that the curse mark and Orochimaru's influence had erected. The internal conflict manifested in his fighting style, creating a strange hybrid approach that confused both combatants. He would begin a combination with Tobirama's precise efficiency, only to pull back at the last moment when his natural compassion reasserted itself. The result was a fight that looked more like a conversation conducted through jutsu, each exchange carrying emotional weight beyond mere tactical considerations. "Stop holding back," Sasuke snarled as he activated his Sharingan, the Tamo spinning with frustrated anger. "If you're going to fight me, then fight me seriously." "He's right," Tobirama's voice observed clinically. "Half measures serve no one. Either commit to subduing him completely or accept that he's lost to Orochimaru's influence." But Naruto couldn't accept either option. Instead, he made a choice that surprised both aspects of his personality. He stopped fighting entirely. "No," he said simply, lowering his hands and stepping back. "I won't fight you seriously, Sasuke. Not because I can't, but because you're my friend, and friends don't try to destroy each other." The gesture was so unexpected that Sasuke's next attack faltered, his Chidori dissipating as confusion replaced rage. "What are you doing?" "Something that Tobirama would never have understood," Naruto replied, speaking as much to the voice in his head as to his friend. "I'm choosing trust over strategy, faith over analysis. The bond we share over the logic that says you're a lost cause." For a moment, something flickered in Sasuke's eyes, a glimpse of the friend Naruto remembered, the teammate who had risked everything to protect people he cared about. But then the curse mark pulsed, flooding his system with corrupted chakra, and the moment passed. "Your sentiment is admirable," Sasuke said, his voice once again cold and distant, "but sentiment won't give me the power I need. Orchimaru can." The final exchange was brief and decisive. Sasuke's enhanced Chidori met Naruto's Rasengan in a clash that split the waterfall and sent shockwaves through the valley. But this time, instead of matching power with power, Naruto used Tobirama's spatial techniques to redirect the energy, creating an opening that allowed him to reach Sasuke directly. The knockout blow was delivered with surgical precision, a pressure point strike that would render Sasuke unconscious without triggering the curse mark's defensive mechanisms. It was exactly the kind of technique Tobirama would have used, efficient and effective, but Naruto's motivation was entirely different. He wasn't subduing an enemy or neutralizing a threat, he was saving a friend from himself. As Sasuke collapsed, the curse mark receding as his consciousness faded, Naruto caught him and gently lowered him to the ground. The gesture was tender in a way that would have been impossible for Tobirama, a reminder that strategic thinking didn't have to come at the cost of basic humanity. Objective achieved, Tobirama's voice noted with satisfaction. Target acquired, minimal casualties, operational security maintained. But Naruto felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for what this victory had cost. He'd saved Sasuke's life, but in doing so, he'd revealed abilities and knowledge that would change how everyone saw him. The simple dynamic of Team 7 was gone forever, replaced by something more complex and potentially more fragile. The return journey to Konoha was conducted in near silence, with Sasuke secured but unconscious and the rest of the team processing what they'd witnessed. Naruto could feel their sideways glances, their unspoken questions about techniques that should have been beyond any genin's abilities. "We need to talk," Shikamaru said quietly as they made camp for the night. "All of us, what happened back there, what you did, it's not something we can just ignore." Naruto nodded, understanding that the time for secrecy was over. His teammates deserved to know at least part of the truth, deserved an explanation for the changes they'd witnessed. "When we get back to the village," he promised, "I'll tell you everything I can." But even as he made the commitment, Naruto wondered if everything was possible. How could he explain reincarnation to people who had never experienced it? How could he convey the constant struggle between two sets of memories, two worldviews, two approaches to every problem? More troubling still was the realization that his success in retrieving Sasuke had come at the cost of embracing Tobirama's methods. He'd used analytical thinking, strategic positioning, and overwhelming tactical advantage to achieve his goals. The techniques were different, but the fundamental approach was the same: identify the problem, develop an efficient solution, execute with minimal collateral damage. "This is what effective leadership looks like," Tobirama's voice observed. Emotional considerations balanced against practical necessities. Sentiment informed by logic, personal bonds serving larger purposes. The assessment was accurate but cold, and it highlighted the central dilemma Naruto now faced. He could be an effective ninja, a capable leader, a strategic asset to Konoha, but only by embracing aspects of Tobirama's personality that felt foreign to his core nature. The alternative was to remain true to himself, but potentially fail at protecting the people and things he cared about most. As he watched over his sleeping teammates, including the unconscious Sasuke whose defection he'd successfully prevented, Naruto realized that his greatest challenge wasn't mastering new techniques or understanding complex political dynamics. It was figuring out how to be both Naruto Uzumaki and the inheritor of Tobirama Senju's legacy without losing himself in the process. The mission had been a success by any objective measure. But personal victories were more complicated, and Naruto was beginning to understand that some battles could be won and lost simultaneously. Tomorrow, there would be debriefings and explanations, consequences, and new responsibilities. Tonight, there was just a young man sitting watch over his friends, carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes and wondering if the price of wisdom was always the loss of innocence. The will of fire burned within him, but it was a more complex flame now, tempered by experience, informed by strategy, and guided by the hard-won knowledge that sometimes saving someone required becoming something you never wanted to be. In the distance, Konoha's lights beckoned like a promise of home and safety. But Naruto knew that returning to the village would only mark the beginning of a new phase in his journey, one where the questions would be harder and the answers far more costly than anything he'd faced before. The debriefing room in the Hokage Tower felt smaller than usual, made claustrophobic by the weight of unspoken questions and barely contained tensions. Naruto sat at one end of the long table, his posture straighter than it had been in months, while the village council occupied the opposite end like judges at a tribunal. Between them, Sunnade presided with the weary authority of someone who had already made too many difficult decisions that morning. Sasuke's return had created ripples that extended far beyond Team 7's reunion. The Uchiha prodigy sat under house arrest in a secure facility, his curse mark sealed but his loyalties still questionable. More troubling for the village leadership was the method of his retrieval, specifically, the impossible techniques that Naruto had displayed during the mission. "Let me understand this correctly," Counselor Himura said, his aged voice carrying decades of political calculation. A genin with no formal training in advanced ninjutsu managed to use Flying Thunder God, multiple high-level water techniques, and tactical coordination that would be impressive for a Jonin commander. That's correct, Shikamaru confirmed reluctantly. He'd been called to provide testimony about the mission, and his analytical nature made him an uncomfortable but reliable witness. Naruto's performance was unprecedented. Naruto felt the familiar weight of Tobirama's memories pressing against his consciousness as the council members exchanged meaningful glances. He could read their expressions with disturbing clarity now, the hunger for a tactical advantage, the calculations about how his abilities could serve village interests, the cold assessment of his value as an asset rather than a person. They see an opportunity, Tobirama's voice observed with clinical detachment. A weapon they can direct rather than a citizen they must protect. This is how it begins, the reduction of the individual to their utility. The question, Counselor Koharu continued, is how such abilities manifested so suddenly. Medical evaluation rules out external influence or artificial enhancement, which leaves us with some rather extraordinary possibilities. Tsunade's knuckles were white where she gripped her sake cup, though her expression remained neutral. Naruto's development has been remarkable, but hardly without precedent. Exceptional circumstances often reveal hidden potential. Hidden potential doesn't explain mastery of techniques that died with the fourth Hokage, Danzo interjected from his position at the table's edge. His bandaged face was impassive, but his visible eye held an intensity that made Naruto's skin crawl. Or tactical knowledge that suggests access to classified strategic documents. The accusation hung in the air like a blade, sharp with implications of treason or espionage. Naruto felt his teammates tense around him, their loyalty warring with their own confusion about his recent changes. I haven't accessed any classified documents, Naruto said quietly, his voice carrying a formality that would have seemed strange weeks ago. My knowledge comes from other sources. What sources? Danzo pressed, leaning forward with predatory interest. Naruto met his gaze steadily, drawing on inherited memories of countless political confrontations. Tobirama had faced men like Danzo before, patriots whose love of country had curdled into something darker, who confused control with protection and surveillance with security. Tell them nothing, Tobirama's instincts urged. Information is power, and power shared is power lost. These men would exploit any advantage you give them, but Naruto's own nature rebelled against such calculated secrecy. His friends deserved better than evasion and half-truths, even if the complete truth was impossible to convey. Hokage-sama, he said, addressing Tsunade directly while ignoring the council's expectant stares. I request a private audience. There are matters I can discuss only with you. The boldness of the request sent murmurs around the table. Genin didn't make demands of the Hokage, didn't claim the right to withhold information from the village council. But something in Naruto's tone, the quiet authority that had been growing stronger each day, made even Danzo pause. Very well, Tsunade said after a moment. Council dismissed. I'll speak with Naruto privately and share relevant information as appropriate. The council members filed out with obvious reluctance, though Danzo lingered longest, his single eye boring into Naruto with unmistakable threat. When the door finally closed, leaving only Tsunade and Naruto in the room, the silence felt both intimate and dangerous. Talk, Tsunade said simply, refilling her sake cup with steady hands. And this time, I want the complete truth. Naruto stared at his hands, gathering courage for revelations that would change everything between them. You know about reincarnation, don't you? About souls that carry memories across lifetimes. Tsunade's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Theoretical possibility. There are legends, stories passed down through certain families. But actual documented cases, she studied his face with new intensity. You're serious. I remember dying, Naruto said quietly, not as myself but as someone else. Someone who helped build this village, who created techniques that shaped modern ninjutsu, who made decisions that still influence policy decades later. Tobirama, Tsunade whispered, the name carrying weight beyond mere syllables. You're claiming to be the reincarnation of the second Hokage. I'm not claiming anything, I'm remembering. Naruto looked up, his eyes holding depths that hadn't been there months ago. I remember designing the village's defensive systems. I remember the debates about clan integration, the compromises that seemed necessary at the time. I remember the guilt of watching those compromises create the very problems they were meant to prevent. Tsunade was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond individual identity. If Naruto truly carried Tobirama's memories, the potential benefits to the village were staggering. strategic knowledge, technical innovations, political insights that could secure Konoha's future for generations. But the costs were equally profound. The boy she'd watched grow from a hyperactive dreamer into something approaching maturity was claiming to carry the burden of another lifetime's mistakes. The psychological toll alone could be devastating. "Prove it," she said finally. Naruto nodded, understanding the necessity. His hands moved through a complex sequence of seals, muscle memory guiding him through a technique that had been his predecessor's greatest achievement and deepest regret. Summoning impure world reincarnation. The jutsu manifested differently without a sacrifice, creating a ghostly outline of a figure that both he and Sunnade recognized immediately. Tobirama Senju appeared as a translucent presence, his red eyes holding the same analytical intensity that had characterized his living years. "Granddaughter," the spirit said, his voice carrying across dimensions with perfect clarity. "You've grown into the leader I always hoped you would become." Sunnade's sake cup shattered against the floor, her composure finally cracking. "Grandfather, but this is impossible. The dead don't simply return because someone remembers them." "Not return," Tobirama corrected, his form flickering like candlelight. "Never left. My soul remained bound to this village, to the responsibilities I failed to complete." This boy carries more than memories. He carries the continuation of work that death interrupted. The conversation that followed lasted hours, covering technical details that only Tobirama could have known, political insights that predated written records, and personal memories that no research could have uncovered. By the time the ghostly presence faded, Sunnade was convinced beyond any doubt of Naruto's claims. "This changes everything," she said once they were alone again. "The council, the other villages, the strategic implications will need to be incredibly careful about how this information is managed." "That's what I'm afraid of," Naruto admitted. "I saw how they looked at me during the debriefing. Like I was a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be protected." Sunnade's expression hardened with protective instincts that surprised them both. "You're still my student, still a citizen of this village. No one will treat you as anything less." But even as she made the promise, both of them understood its limitations. Political necessity had a way of overwhelming personal sentiment, and the village's needs would ultimately take precedence over individual concerns. Over the following days, Naruto found himself walking a precarious balance between maintaining his relationships and managing the expectations that came with his unique situation. The village council had been temporarily satisfied with assurances that he posed no security threat, but their interest in his capabilities remained uncomfortably intense. More troubling was the growing distance between him and his peers. Team 7's dynamic had fundamentally shifted since the Retrieval mission, with Sakura treating him with wary respect and Kakashi observing him with the analytical eye of a teacher reassessing a student's potential. But it was Sasuke's reaction that troubled him most. The Uchiha prodigy had been released from secure custody but remained under constant surveillance, his movements monitored and his activities restricted. During their first conversation since his attempted defection, his questions had been pointed and uncomfortable. "You held back during our fight," Sasuke said without preamble, cornering Naruto in one of the village's quieter training grounds. "I could feel it, techniques you didn't use, strategies you abandoned." "Why?" Naruto considered several possible answers, weighing honesty against security concerns. "Because you're my friend. I wasn't going to seriously hurt you just to prove a point. That's not what I mean, and you know it." Sasuke's sharing and activated, the Tamo spinning with frustrated intensity. "You fought like someone with decades of experience. Movements I'd never seen from you, tactical thinking that was completely different from your usual approach. It was like fighting a completely different person." "He's perceptive," Tobirama's voice observed. The Sharingan allows him to analyze combat patterns with exceptional detail. Maintaining deception will be increasingly difficult. "People change," Naruto said carefully. "The invasion, the training with Jiraiya, watching you almost throw everything away, it all had an impact." "Change, yes. Complete personality transformation, no." Sasuke stepped closer, his dark eyes searching Naruto's face for tells that his bloodline would help him identify. "There's something you're not telling me. Something that explains why you suddenly know techniques that should be impossible for someone our age to master." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of an ANBU operative, whose bird mask and formal posture immediately put both genin on guard. "Naruto Uzumaki," the operative said in a voice carefully modulated to convey authority without threat. "The Hokage requests your immediate presence for a sensitive matter." As they made their way to the Hokage Tower, Naruto's enhanced analytical abilities automatically cataloged details about their escort. The operative's movement patterns suggested route training rather than standard ANBU protocols, which meant Danzo's influence was extending into areas that should have been beyond his reach. Classic power consolidation strategy Tobirama's memories supplied. Use official channels to gain access, then leverage that access for unofficial purposes. This man isn't here to escort you, he's here to evaluate you. The realization sent a chill down Naruto's spine. If Danzo was already moving to influence his situation, it meant the village's darker elements saw him as either an opportunity or a threat that needed to be controlled. Sunnade was waiting in her office with an expression that mixed concern with barely contained anger. Beside her stood Jiraiya, whose normally relaxed demeanor had been replaced by something approaching military alertness. "We have a problem," Sunnade said without preamble. "Someone has been accessing restricted archives, specifically files related to the second Hokage's research projects. Security believes it may be connected to your recent developments." Naruto felt his stomach drop. His exploration of Tobirama's hidden research had been careful, but apparently not careful enough. Now suspicion would fall on him for activities that were technically accurate. "I can explain," he began, but Jiraiya cut him off with a gesture. "Before you say anything," the Sannin said seriously, "you should know that this office is under surveillance. Anything you admit here will be recorded and potentially used against you." The warning was delivered with subtle hand signs that Naruto recognized from Tobirama's memories, a coded language used for sensitive communications when conventional security was compromised. The message was clear: forces within the village were moving against him, and official channels could no longer be trusted. "Danzo," Tobirama's voice whispered with certainty. "This has his signature: create a crisis, offer a solution, consolidate control over the valuable asset. He used similar tactics during my lifetime." "I understand," Naruto replied, his own hand signs acknowledging the warning while requesting guidance. What followed was a careful dance of communication, with surface conversations covering official business while coded gestures exchanged the real information. Naruto learned that his access to the archives had been detected, that pressure was mounting to place him under closer supervision, and that certain elements within the village were pushing for a more aggressive approach to managing his unique situation. More disturbing was the revelation that similar pressure was being applied regarding Sasuke's status. The Uchiha's defection and return had created political complications that some saw as opportunities for broader policy changes. "They want to use both of us," Naruto realized with growing horror. "Sasuke as justification for stricter clan oversight, me as a source of strategic advantages they can exploit." The meeting ended with careful non-commitments and promises to consider various recommendations, but Naruto understood the subtext. He was running out of time before political forces beyond his control made decisions about his future. That evening, guided by memories that felt as real as his own experiences, Naruto made his way to a section of Konoha that few people knew existed. Beneath the village's foundations, accessible through maintenance tunnels that ostensibly served the sewer system, lay a network of chambers that Tobirama had constructed during the village's early years. The hidden laboratory was exactly as he remembered it, though decades of abandonment had left everything covered in dust and cobwebs. Scrolls filled with research notes lined the walls, their preservation seals still functioning after all these years. Equipment that had been advanced for its time sat covered by tarps, waiting for hands that understood their purpose. But it was the central chamber that held Naruto's attention, specifically the large ceiling array carved into its floor. Complex beyond anything most ninja would ever see, it incorporated elements from multiple disciplines: spatial manipulation, chakra storage, even theoretical work on soul manipulation that bordered on the forbidden. My greatest project, Tobirama's memories supplied, and my most dangerous, the contingency that I hoped would never be necessary. As Naruto studied the array, understanding began to dawn. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a failsafe, designed to activate under specific conditions that would threaten the village's survival. His reincarnation hadn't been an accident or a natural occurrence. It had been planned, programmed into the very foundations of Konoha itself. In the center of the array, a pedestal held a scroll sealed with protections that would have deterred anyone except the person it was intended for. Naruto approached it with reverent caution, understanding that he was about to receive instructions from his past self, guidance for threats that wouldn't emerge for decades after Tobirama's death. The scroll unsealed at his touch, responding to chakra signatures that transcended individual lifetimes. What he read made his blood run cold. If you are reading this, then the conditions for your activation have been met. Threats to Konoha's survival have emerged that require knowledge and abilities I possessed in life. You carry not just my memories, but my responsibilities, including some that I pray you will never need to fulfill. The village faces dangers I foresaw but could not prevent. Political corruption from within, manipulation by those who confuse control with protection, and external threats that will test every system I helped establish. You have been awakened to serve as both guardian and guide, to make the choices I was not given time to make. But beware, the path ahead will demand sacrifices that your nature will resist. Leadership requires decisions that preserve the many at the cost of the few, strategies that prioritize effectiveness over sentiment. The boy you were and the man I was must find balance, or both will be destroyed by the weight of what is required. In the sealed chamber beneath this laboratory, you will find resources prepared for the conflicts ahead. Use them wisely, trust sparingly, and remember that the greatest threats to what we love often come from within. May you succeed where I failed, and may the will of fire burn bright through whatever darkness lies ahead. Tobirama Senju, second Hokage of Konoha Hagakure. The implications were staggering. His reincarnation wasn't just a spiritual phenomenon. It was part of a defensive system that Tobirama had embedded into the village itself, triggered by specific threat conditions and designed to provide Konoha with advantages that normal means couldn't achieve. But more troubling was the scroll's assumption that he would need to make the same kinds of difficult choices that had defined Tobirama's legacy. The suggestion that sentiment must be balanced against effectiveness, that individual concerns might need to be sacrificed for larger purposes. This is what they want from me, Naruto realized with crystal clarity. Not just techniques or strategic knowledge, but the willingness to make decisions that prioritize the village over everything else. They want me to become him completely. As he made his way back through the hidden passages, Naruto carried the weight of inherited destiny and personal choice. The political pressures he'd been feeling weren't coincidental. They were part of a larger pattern that Tobirama had anticipated, responses to his reawakening that would push him toward embracing his predecessor's mindset fully. The question was whether he could find a different path, one that honored Tobirama's legacy while remaining true to his own values. Or whether the threats ahead would be so severe that such choices became luxuries he couldn't afford. Back in his apartment, Naruto sat by the window overlooking the village he'd sworn to protect. Somewhere out there, Sasuke was struggling with his own inherited burdens, fighting against the darkness that had claimed so many of his clan. Somewhere else, political forces were maneuvering to control assets they didn't understand. And deep beneath the village, chambers filled with resources and contingencies waited for a leader who might need to become everything his nature opposed in order to preserve what he loved most. The will of fire burned within him, but it was a more complex flame now, tempered by wisdom, informed by strategy, and weighted with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest strength required the greatest sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures to choose between sentiment and effectiveness. Tonight, Naruto Uzumaki sat in darkness, carrying the hopes and fears of 2 lifetimes, and wondered if he could find a way to be both the hero his friends needed and the leader his village required. The answer, he suspected, lay not in choosing between his nature and his inheritance, but in finding a synthesis that transcended both. Whether such a balance was possible remained to be seen, but the attempt would define not just his future, but the future of everyone he'd sworn to protect. In the distance, Konoha slept peacefully, protected by walls and treaties and the dedication of its ninja. But its greatest protection and its greatest danger lay in the promise of a young man who had learned that some destinies were chosen, others inherited, and the hardest ones required you to become something greater than either. The intelligence reached Konoha through channels so secret that only the Hokage and her most trusted advisors were privy to its contents. Itachi Uchiha had been spotted in the Land of Fire, moving with a companion whose identity remained unclear but whose presence suggested Akatsuki business. The implications were staggering. Either the organization was planning another assault on the village, or something even more complex was unfolding. Naruto learned of this development not through official channels, but through the enhanced intuition that came with Tobirama's memories. He felt it as a disturbance in the village's spiritual equilibrium, a ripple of tension that spoke to inherited instincts about threats to Konoha's security. When he made his way to the Hokage's office that morning, he found Sunnade already deep in crisis management. "How did you know to come here?" she asked without looking up from the intelligence reports scattered across her desk. "I felt something change," Naruto replied, settling into the chair across from her. Over the past month, their relationship had evolved into something approaching partnership. He provided insights that only Tobirama's experience could offer, while she navigated the political complexities his presence had created. "Itachi Uchiha has been confirmed within our borders," Sunnade said bluntly. "Given his history and current affiliations, the council is demanding immediate action." Naruto felt his chest tighten, not just with concern for the village's safety, but with the weight of inherited guilt. Through Tobirama's memories, he understood the true complexity of the Uchiha massacre. Not just the immediate horror of that night, but the decades of policy decisions that had made it seem necessary. "The police force was meant to honor them," Tobirama's voice whispered with familiar defensiveness. "Giving them authority, recognition, a vital role in village security. How was I to know it would become a prison instead of a platform?" But Naruto had access to more than just Tobirama's perspective now. He'd spent weeks studying the archived reports, the policy papers, the careful documentation of a clan's gradual isolation. What had been presented as tactical wisdom had created the very conditions that forced Itachi's impossible choice. "What kind of action?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Danzo is pushing for immediate elimination protocols," Sunnade replied grimly. He argues that Itachi's presence represents an unacceptable security risk, especially with Sasuke's recent instability. The euphemism didn't hide the underlying political calculation. Sasuke's defection and return had created ammunition for those who viewed the Uchiha bloodline as inherently dangerous. That Itachi had returned now during a period of heightened suspicion felt too convenient to be coincidental. And Sasuke doesn't know? Not yet, but he will soon. Intelligence of this magnitude can't be contained indefinitely. Sunnade looked up from her papers, her expression troubled. "I need you to be prepared for his reaction. Your influence with him may be the only thing that prevents another defection." Naruto nodded, understanding the subtext. Sasuke's loyalty to the village remained fragile, maintained more by personal bonds than institutional commitment. If he learned that his brother was nearby and the village planned hostile action, those bonds might not be sufficient to hold him. This is how it begins. Tobirama's memories provided with uncomfortable clarity. Political pressure creates impossible situations, which generate desperate responses, which justify the very policies that created the pressure in the first place. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. "There might be another way," Naruto said slowly, an idea forming that combined Tobirama's strategic thinking with his own moral instincts. "What if Itachi's presence isn't a threat but an opportunity?" Sunnade's eyebrows rose. "Explain." "He's here for a reason, not random movement, not coincidence. Akatsuki doesn't waste resources on meaningless gestures. If we can determine what he wants, we might be able to resolve this situation without bloodshed." "The council won't approve direct negotiation with a missing nin," Sunnade pointed out. "Especially one responsible for the murder of an entire clan." "Then we don't tell the council," Naruto replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become more natural over recent weeks. "Some decisions are too important to be left to committee." The statement would have been shocking coming from the old Naruto, but Sunnade simply nodded thoughtfully. His gradual integration of Tobirama's memories had brought not just tactical knowledge, but an understanding of when conventional channels needed to be bypassed for the greater good. "And how exactly do you propose to make contact with an S-rank missing nin who could kill you before you finish speaking?" Naruto's smile held no humor. "I have advantages that most people don't, including techniques that died with the fourth Hokage." 3 hours later, Naruto made his way through Konoha streets with the casual gait of someone running routine errands. But his destination was far from routine, a meeting that could either prevent a tragedy or trigger the very crisis they were trying to avoid. The abandoned Uchiha district still bore scars from the massacre, though nature had begun to reclaim some of the damaged buildings. Weeds grew through cracked pavement and several structures showed signs of partial collapse. But the area's most significant feature was its isolation. Few people visited the district anymore, making it ideal for clandestine meetings. Naruto had chosen the location carefully, guided by inherited knowledge of village geography and an intuitive understanding of Itachi's psychological profile. The elder Uchiha would be drawn to this place, not from nostalgia, but from the need to confront the consequences of his choices. "He carries guilt that makes my own seem trivial," Tobirama's voice observed with something approaching sympathy. "The burden of necessary evil accepted for the sake of those he loved." I understand that weight. The observation was telling. Tobirama's reincarnation had brought not just memories and techniques, but emotional resonance with decisions that transcended individual lifetimes. Both men had made choices that preserved the village while destroying parts of themselves. Itachi materialized from the shadows with the fluid grace that marked truly elite ninja, his red eyes already active and analyzing potential threats. But instead of attacking immediately, he paused, studying Naruto with an expression that mixed surprise with calculation. "You've changed," Itachi said quietly, his voice carrying the same analytical detachment that Naruto had been fighting against in himself. "Your chakra signature, your posture, even the way you breathe, none of it matches my memories of Naruto Uzumaki." "People grow," Naruto replied, deliberately echoing words he'd used with Sasuke weeks earlier. "Especially when they learn things about themselves they never expected." Itachi's Sharingan spun slowly, reading micro-expressions and chakra fluctuations with supernatural precision. What he saw made him step back slightly, his composed facade cracking just enough to reveal genuine shock. "Impossible," he whispered. "That chakra pattern, that spiritual resonance, it's identical to historical records of Tobirama Senju," Naruto confirmed. "The second Hokage, though I prefer to think of him as my previous incarnation rather than my current identity." The revelation hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp with implications that neither could fully process. Itachi's mind raced through political calculations and strategic assessments, while Naruto watched emotions flicker across features trained to reveal nothing. "If that's true," Itachi said slowly, "then you know why I'm here. You understand what my return means for both the village and my brother. I know that you've been carrying a burden that was never yours alone to bear," Naruto replied, his voice gentle with inherited understanding. "The massacre wasn't just your decision, Itachi. It was the culmination of policies and prejudices that created an impossible situation." For the first time since his childhood, Itachi's perfect composure cracked completely. His Sharingan deactivated as tears began to flow down his cheeks, though his voice remained steady. "You know about the political pressure, the surveillance, the gradual isolation that made my clan desperate enough to plan a coup. I know because I helped create those conditions," Naruto admitted, the words tasting like poison. "Not me personally, but the man whose memories I carry. Tobirama's policies regarding the Uchiha were well-intentioned, but they planted the seeds of everything that followed." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either had experienced, a confessional that transcended individual guilt and touched on systemic failures that had shaped Konoha's history. Itachi spoke of the impossible choice between clan and village, of watching his family's growing desperation, of accepting damnation to preserve the peace that Tobirama and Hashirama had built. Naruto, in turn, shared the inherited memories of policy discussions and strategic decisions that had seemed logical at the time. The police force designed to honor the Uchiha had gradually become a method of containment. The residential district intended to provide clan autonomy had evolved into a form of segregation. Every well-intentioned measure had contributed to the isolation that made rebellion seem like the only option. "Why are you here now?" Naruto asked finally. "What's changed that brought you back?" Itachi was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he weighed secrets that could reshape the ninja world's balance of power. "Sasuke is awakening abilities that he doesn't understand," he said eventually. "The Mangekyou Sharingan requires specific conditions to manifest, but once it does, the power comes with prices that most Uchiha never fully comprehend." Naruto felt his blood chill. He'd noticed subtle changes in Sasuke's behavior since the Retrieval mission. Increased aggression, deeper mood swings, moments of detachment that reminded him uncomfortably of the distance that had preceded the original defection. What kind of prices? Physical deterioration, emotional instability, and in extreme cases, a form of madness that makes rational decision-making nearly impossible. Itachi's voice carried the weight of personal experience. "I came to provide him with information that might prevent the worst outcomes, but doing so requires revealing truths that could destroy his relationship with the village entirely." The implications were staggering. If Sasuke learned the full truth about the massacre, not just Itachi's role, but the political forces that had made it necessary, his fragile loyalty to Konoha might shatter entirely. But without that knowledge, his evolving abilities could pose an even greater threat. "There might be another way," Naruto said, an idea forming that combined Tobirama's strategic thinking with his own commitment to preserving bonds. "What if we could address the underlying conditions instead of just managing the symptoms?" "Explain." The policies that isolated your clan, the prejudices that made the massacre seem necessary, they're still in place, aren't they? Still shaping how the village views bloodline abilities and clan loyalties. Itachi nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his dark eyes. What if we could change those policies? Remove the structural conditions that created the original crisis? Naruto's voice gained intensity as the plan crystallized. Not just for the Uchiha, but for all the clans that carry similar burdens. The village council would never approve such changes, Itachi pointed out. Too much political capital is invested in maintaining current power structures. Then we bypass the council, Naruto replied with quiet determination. Some changes are too important to be left to politicians who profit from the status quo. What followed was a planning session that would have been impossible weeks earlier. Naruto's inherited knowledge of village systems, combining with Itachi's understanding of clan dynamics to develop a strategy for systemic reform. They identified key pressure points in Konoha's political structure, potential allies who might support change, and methods for implementing new policies without triggering the very conflicts they were trying to prevent. But as they talked, Naruto became increasingly aware of footsteps approaching from multiple directions. His enhanced senses, honed by weeks of integrating Tobirama's abilities, identified the chakra signatures before the figures became visible. "We have company," he said quietly, his hand moving automatically toward the kunai pouch at his waist. Sasuke emerged from behind a partially collapsed building, his Sharingan already active and spinning with agitated energy. Behind him came Sakura, her medical training evident in the way she positioned herself to provide support rather than direct confrontation. And from the opposite direction, moving with the fluid precision of an elite operative, came Sai, whose presence suggested that this encounter was no coincidence. "Brother," Sasuke said, his voice carrying emotions too complex for simple categorization. "I felt your chakra signature, I knew you were here." Itachi straightened, his composed mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. But Naruto could see the pain in his eyes. The weight of seeing the brother he'd tried so desperately to protect now grown into a young man shaped by trauma and loss. "Sasuke," Itachi replied simply, as if greeting him in their family's compound rather than in the ruins of their murdered clan. "Why?" The question tore itself from Sasuke's throat with anguish that made even Sai flinch. "Why did you come back? Why now?" Before Itachi could answer, Sai stepped forward with the mechanical precision that marked his root training. "Uchiha Itachi, by order of the Konoha Council, you are under arrest for crimes against the village and its citizens. Surrender peacefully or face immediate elimination." The demand shattered the delicate balance of the moment, transforming a family reunion into a potential battlefield. Naruto felt Tobirama's tactical instincts surge to the forefront, analyzing positions and calculating optimal responses with cold efficiency. 3 allied ninja, 1 S-rank missing nin, 1 emotionally unstable Uchiha with evolving abilities. Terrain favors mobile combat but limits escape routes. Priority: prevent casualties while maintaining operational objectives. But even as his inherited strategic mind processed the situation, Naruto's core nature rebelled against treating his friends as tactical variables. This wasn't a combat scenario to be optimized, it was a human crisis that required empathy and understanding. "Stand down, Sai," he said with quiet authority, stepping between the root operative and Itachi. "This situation is more complex than your orders account for." "I have direct authorization from," Sai began, but Naruto cut him off with a gesture that carried absolute certainty. "Your authorization doesn't supersede Hokage-level intelligence operations," he said, relying on Tobirama's knowledge of bureaucratic hierarchies to create plausible authority. "This meeting is part of a larger strategic initiative that you weren't cleared to know about." Sai hesitated, his conditioning warring with the apparent logic of Naruto's claim. In that moment of uncertainty, Sasuke's emotional state finally overwhelmed his control. "Enough!" The younger Uchiha's chakra flared with dangerous intensity, his Sharingan evolving before their eyes from 3 Tamo to something entirely new. The Mangekyo pattern that emerged was unique, reflecting the specific trauma and emotional resonance that had triggered its awakening. "Sasuke, no," Sakura called out, recognizing the signs of chakra overflow from her medical training. "Your body can't handle that level of energy output." But Sasuke was beyond hearing, lost in the emotional maelstrom that came with accessing powers he didn't understand. The technique he began forming was unfamiliar but clearly devastating, black flames that burned with spiritual as well as physical intensity. Amaterasu, Tobirama's memories identified with clinical precision. Mangekyo technique passed down through Uchiha bloodline. Unquenchable flames that burn whatever the user looks at, extremely dangerous in populated areas. The analysis was followed by tactical recommendations that made Naruto's stomach turn. Optimal response involved immediate incapacitation of the user through overwhelming force, prioritizing village safety over individual survival. It was exactly the kind of logic that had created this crisis in the first place. Instead, Naruto made a choice that honored both his nature and his inheritance. His hands moved through the seals for Flying Thunder God, but instead of using the technique for attack, he used it for protection. The spatial displacement carried him directly beside Sasuke, close enough to place a hand on his shoulder and channel calming chakra through their physical connection. "Sasuke," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the emotional storm with gentle certainty. "Look at me, really look at me." The younger Uchiha's Mangekyo focused on Naruto's face, and what he saw there made him pause. The friend he'd grown up with was still present, but layered over with depths of experience and understanding that spoke to burdens beyond his years. "You're carrying something," Sasuke said, his voice hollow with exhaustion as the flames began to dissipate. "Something heavy, something that changes how you see everything." "Yes," Naruto admitted, "just like you are. Just like your brother has been for years." The honesty in his tone broke through Sasuke's emotional barriers in a way that force never could have. The Mangekyo deactivated, leaving him swaying on his feet as the chakra drain caught up with him. Sakura moved immediately to provide medical support, while Sai remained frozen between conflicting imperatives. It was Itachi who broke the tableau, moving with fluid grace to kneel beside his exhausted brother. "The power you just accessed comes with prices you don't yet understand," he said gently. "Let me help you learn to control it before it controls you." "Help me?" Sasuke's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "You destroyed our family, abandoned the village, joined the organization that's hunting my teammate. Why would I accept anything from you?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp with years of accumulated pain and betrayal. But before Itachi could answer, Naruto spoke up with inherited wisdom that transcended individual perspective. "Because sometimes the people who understand our burdens best are the ones who have made the same impossible choices," he said quietly. "Your brother isn't your enemy, Sasuke. He's someone who sacrificed everything, including your love, to protect what mattered most." "Protect what?" Sasuke demanded. "He murdered our parents, our cousins, everyone we grew up with. How is that protection?" "He prevented a civil war that would have destroyed Konoha and gotten you killed in the process," Naruto replied, his voice heavy with inherited understanding. "The Uchiha coup was real, Sasuke. Your father was planning to overthrow the village government. If Itachi hadn't acted when he did, the conflict would have torn the village apart and made every Uchiha a target for elimination." The revelation hit Sasuke like a physical blow, his worldview reordering itself around facts that made his brother's actions comprehensible if not forgivable. But the knowledge came with new questions, deeper implications that threatened to overwhelm his already fragile emotional state. "The village knew," he whispered. "They ordered him to do it." Naruto and Itachi exchanged glances, understanding that the next few moments would determine not just Sasuke's loyalty to Konoha, but his entire relationship with the ninja system that had shaped his life. "It's complicated," Naruto said finally. "The orders came from people who thought they were protecting the village, but those same people created the conditions that made the coup seem necessary in the first place." "What conditions?" Sasuke's voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a young man preparing to learn truths that would change everything. Naruto looked around at the ruins of the Uchiha district, at the evidence of a massacre that could have been prevented if different choices had been made decades earlier. "The same conditions that are still in place today," he said quietly. "The same prejudices and policies that treat bloodline abilities as threats rather than gifts, that prioritize control over trust, that create the very problems they claim to solve." As the sun began to set over Konoha, casting long shadows through the abandoned district, Naruto found himself at the center of a conversation that would reshape the village's future. The political forces that had brought them all together, Sasuke's evolving abilities, Itachi's return, Sai's arrest orders, were symptoms of deeper systemic issues that required more than tactical solutions. But for the first time since his memories of Tobirama had begun to surface, Naruto felt genuinely hopeful. The cycle of mistrust and retaliation that had claimed so many lives didn't have to continue. With patience, wisdom, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, it might be possible to build something better. The will of fire burned bright within him, but it was a more mature flame now, tempered by experience, informed by understanding, and guided by the knowledge that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in the techniques you inherited, but in the wisdom to use them in service of bonds rather than power. As darkness settled over the district, 4 ninjas sat among the ruins of past failures and began planning a future that honored both the dead and the living. It would be difficult, dangerous, and potentially impossible, but it was also necessary, and that was enough to make the attempt worthwhile. The conversation that followed would change everything, but that was a story for another day. Tonight, there was only the promise of reconciliation, the hope of redemption, and the fragile beginnings of trust between people who had been shaped by the same tragic history. In the distance, Konoha's lights beckoned like a promise of home and belonging. But the most important light was the one that burned between them, the shared understanding that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone, and some truths too important to remain hidden any longer. The first sign of trouble came not through conventional intelligence channels, but through the enhanced spiritual awareness that Naruto had been developing since his memories of Tobirama had begun to surface. He felt it as a disturbance in the village's chakra network, a subtle wrongness that spoke to inherited instincts about threats to Konoha's security. It was 3 days after the confrontation in the Uchiha district, and the delicate process of rebuilding trust between the brothers had been proceeding with cautious optimism. Sasuke remained under official surveillance, but the restrictions had been quietly relaxed as Sunnade worked behind the scenes to implement some of the policy changes that Naruto and Itachi had outlined. But now, as Naruto stood on the roof of his apartment building watching the sunrise paint Konoha's skyline in shades of gold and crimson, he felt something approaching that made his blood run cold. Multiple chakra signatures. Extremely powerful, moving with purpose toward the village perimeter. The analysis came automatically, accompanied by tactical assessments that would have been impossible weeks ago. Range, probable abilities, optimal defensive positioning, all of it processed in seconds with the clinical efficiency that marked Tobirama's strategic mind. But it was the identity of one particular signature that made him move with desperate urgency. Payne, the leader of Akatsuki, here now, when the village is still recovering from internal political upheaval. Naruto's hands moved through the seals for Flying Thunder God without conscious thought, spacetime jutsu carrying him directly to the Hokage Tower where he materialized in Sunnade's office with enough force to crack the wooden floor. Akatsuki, he said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority that had become natural over recent weeks. Multiple operatives led by Payne himself, they'll reach the outer perimeter in approximately 15 minutes. Sunnade looked up from the mission report scattered across her desk, her expression shifting from surprise to grim calculation in seconds. "How do you know?" "I can feel them," Naruto replied, then caught himself. The old explanation of gut instinct wouldn't suffice anymore, not when he was requesting immediate mobilization of the village's defenses based on capabilities that bordered on the mystical. "Enhanced chakra sensitivity," he clarified, drawing on Tobirama's knowledge of detection techniques. "The same abilities that allowed me to use Flying Thunder God also provide limited precognitive awareness of large-scale threat convergence." It was a plausible explanation that avoided revealing the full extent of his inherited capabilities. Sunnade studied him for a moment, weighing the implications of acting on intelligence that couldn't be verified through conventional means. "If you're wrong," she began. "Then we waste resources on a training exercise," Naruto interrupted. "If I'm right and we don't act, we lose the village." The certainty in his voice decided her. Sunnade's hand slammed down on the emergency alert button, filling the air with the piercing wail of sirens that would bring every available ninja to defensive positions. "What are their likely objectives?" she asked as they moved toward the window that overlooked the village center. Naruto's enhanced analytical abilities were already processing that question, drawing on both Tobirama's strategic experience and his own understanding of Akatsuki's operations. "Primary target is almost certainly me, the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki. But Payne's philosophy involves demonstrating power through destruction, so he'll want to make a statement that resonates beyond simple extraction." Naruto paused, accessing memories that felt both ancient and immediate. "He'll try to break the village's will to resist by targeting civilian populations and infrastructure." Classic siege doctrine, Tobirama's voice confirmed. "Demoralize the defenders, eliminate their ability to coordinate resistance, then extract the strategic asset with minimal opposition." The analysis was sound, but it came with implications that made Naruto's stomach turn. Protecting the village would require him to think like the enemy, to anticipate targeting priorities and resource allocation with the same cold logic that had once designed Konoha's defensive systems. "Evacuation protocols?" Sunnade asked as they watched ninja beginning to take defensive positions throughout the village. Insufficient time for full civilian evacuation, Naruto replied automatically, then caught himself. He was thinking like a military strategist rather than the protector of innocent people, prioritizing tactical considerations over individual lives. This is exactly how it starts, he realized with growing alarm. The gradual shift from seeing people as citizens to seeing them as variables in a larger equation. We evacuate everyone we can, he said, his voice carrying more warmth than it had moments before. And we make our defensive positions mobile enough to protect those we can't move in time. Sunnade nodded, understanding the emotional struggle behind his tactical recommendations. And our response strategy? Before Naruto could answer, the first explosion echoed across the village. A massive detonation from the eastern gate that sent shock waves through the buildings around them. Through the window, they could see smoke beginning to rise from multiple points along the perimeter. They're not coming to negotiate, Naruto said grimly. This is a full assault. The next few minutes passed in a blur of coordinated chaos as Konoha's defensive systems activated with the efficiency that Tobirama had built into their design decades earlier. Barrier teams took positions at critical infrastructure points, medical units established triage centers in protected areas, and combat squads moved to engage the attackers using predetermined response patterns. But even as he watched the village respond to the crisis with professional competence, Naruto could see the limitations of conventional defensive strategy. Payne's assault wasn't following standard attack patterns. It was specifically designed to overwhelm systematic responses through unpredictable targeting and overwhelming force. He knows our defensive doctrine, Tobirama's analytical mind observed, either through intelligence gathering or direct observation. Standard protocols will be insufficient, which meant Naruto would have to do something he'd been avoiding since his memories had begun to surface. Take direct command of the village's military response using knowledge and authority that officially didn't exist. Sunnade-sama, he said quietly, I need you to authorize irregular command protocols. She turned to look at him, understanding immediately what he was requesting. You want field command authority. Naruto, you're still technically a genin. The political implications will be manageable if there's still a village left to have politics in, he finished. I know these attack patterns, I know how to counter them. But I can't do it through normal chains of command. The explosion that followed was closer, powerful enough to rattle the windows of the Hokage Tower. Through the smoke, they could see one of Payne's bodies advancing through the eastern district, its massive size and strange appearance marking it as something beyond normal ninja capabilities. Sunnade's decision took less than 3 seconds. Field authorization granted, temporary tactical command, duration of crisis only. She pulled out her official seal, marking a scroll with the authority that would make his orders legally binding. Don't make me regret this. Naruto accepted the scroll with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. The weight of command felt familiar in ways that should have been impossible, not because of the responsibility it represented, but because he'd carried it before in another lifetime, during conflicts that had shaped the ninja world's current structure. Remember, Tobirama's voice whispered as Naruto prepared to leave the office, leadership in crisis requires decisions that preserve the whole even when parts are lost. Personal sentiment must be balanced against strategic necessity. But even as the inherited wisdom pressed against his consciousness, Naruto's core nature asserted itself with stubborn determination. He would protect the village, but he would do it in a way that honored both his past knowledge and his present values. The battle that followed was unlike anything Konoha had experienced since the Third Great Ninja War. Payne's assault combined overwhelming individual power with tactical sophistication that suggested deep understanding of the village's defensive capabilities. His 6 bodies moved with coordinated precision, each one targeting specific weaknesses in Konoha's military structure. But what should have been a devastating surprise attack became something closer to an even fight thanks to Naruto's strategic interventions. Using Flying Thunder God to coordinate defensive positions in real time, he was able to redirect resources and anticipate enemy movements with supernatural accuracy. Deva Path approaching the commercial district from Vector 770. Civilian evacuation incomplete in that sector. Animal Path summoning large-scale creatures near the academy. Anti-summoning protocols authorized for all Chunin level and above personnel. Usura Path demonstrating ranged artillery capabilities. Counter-battery fire required at coordinates. The tactical coordination he provided was seamless, professional, and devastatingly effective. But more importantly, it was guided by an understanding that every defensive position contained people worth protecting, not just strategic assets worth preserving. When the Deva Path's gravity manipulation began collapsing buildings in the residential district, Naruto didn't calculate acceptable casualty ratios. He teleported directly into the danger zone and began evacuating civilians personally, using shadow clones and spatial techniques to extract people faster than the destruction could claim them. When the Animal Path's summons threatened to overrun the hospital district, he didn't order tactical withdrawal to preserve combat effectiveness. He coordinated a counterassault that prioritized protecting the wounded and medical staff, even when it meant accepting higher risks for the combat personnel involved. "This is inefficient," Tobirama's voice observed with clinical disapproval. "Resource allocation should prioritize military assets over civilian populations during active combat phases." But Naruto ignored the inherited strategic wisdom, trusting instead in the bonds and values that had always defined his approach to protecting others. And remarkably, impossibly, it worked. His willingness to take personal risks for individual civilians inspired similar dedication from the ninja under his command. His strategic brilliance, when combined with genuine care for every life at stake, created a defensive response that was both tactically sound and morally uncompromising. The turning point came when Payne's assault reached the village center, specifically targeting the Hokage Tower and the administrative buildings that housed Konoha's governmental functions. The attack was clearly designed to decapitate the village's leadership structure, leaving the population demoralized and leaderless. But instead of defending from fixed positions as conventional doctrine would suggest, Naruto made a choice that combined Tobirama's tactical brilliance with his own instinctive understanding of what the village truly needed. He walked out to meet Payne directly, alone in the open space before the Hokage Tower. The sight of a single figure facing down Akatsuki's leader should have been laughable, but something about Naruto's presence, the quiet confidence, the perfect balance between relaxation and readiness, the subtle wrongness in his chakra signature that spoke to powers beyond normal comprehension, made even Payne pause. "Naruto Uzumaki," the orange-haired leader said, his purple eyes analyzing the young ninja with calculating intensity. "You've changed since our last encounter." "People grow," Naruto replied, echoing words he'd used in other confrontations over recent weeks. "Especially when they learn things about themselves they never expected." Payne's expression didn't change, but his other bodies began moving to flank positions around the plaza. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki. "You will come with us voluntarily or this village will be reduced to rubble." "No," Naruto said simply, "I won't, and neither will you reduce anything to rubble because I'm going to stop you." The certainty in his voice was absolute, carrying conviction that went beyond mere determination. But it wasn't bravado or naive optimism. It was the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was facing and had already calculated the optimal response. "You cannot comprehend the gap between your power and mine," Payne said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never been successfully opposed. "I am the leader of Akatsuki, wielder of the Rinnegan, bringer of Nagato," Naruto interrupted, and the name hit Payne like a physical blow. "Your name is Nagato, you're from the Hidden Rain Village. You were trained by Jiraiya-sensei along with Konan and Yahiko, and you're in pain, not just physical pain from maintaining those puppet bodies, but emotional pain from watching your dreams of peace twisted into justifications for mass murder." The revelation shattered Payne's composed facade completely. For a moment, the calculating deity was replaced by a young man whose world had been destroyed by forces beyond his control, who had embraced power because it seemed like the only alternative to helplessness. How? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Because I carry the memories of someone who made similar choices," Naruto replied gently. "Someone who thought that sufficient force applied with strategic precision could create lasting peace. Someone who learned too late that power without compassion only creates new cycles of hatred." "This is dangerous," Tobirama's voice warned. "Emotional appeals are unreliable in tactical situations. Strike while he's disoriented." But Naruto ignored the inherited strategic advice, trusting instead in the approach that had always served him best, reaching out to the humanity hidden beneath layers of pain and anger. "You started as someone who wanted to protect his friends," he continued, taking a step closer despite the obvious danger. "Just like I did, but somewhere along the way, protecting became controlling and controlling became destroying. It doesn't have to continue." The conversation that followed was conducted on multiple levels, spoken words that addressed Nagato's philosophical justifications for his actions, and subtle chakra manipulations that demonstrated techniques the young man had never seen before. Naruto's inherited knowledge of spacetime nin jutsu allowed him to counter Payne's gravity-based attacks with spatial redirections that sent the destructive force harmlessly into the sky. More importantly, his understanding of the emotional cycles that drove the pursuit of power allowed him to address the psychological foundations of Nagato's hatred. Every argument for the necessity of force was met with examples of alternatives that preserved both peace and humanity. Pain is the only teacher that brings understanding, Nagato had argued through his pain bodies. Pain teaches fear, not understanding, Naruto had replied. Understanding comes from connection, from seeing yourself in others, from choosing to care about their suffering even when you have the power to ignore it. The battle became less about jutsu and more about philosophy, each exchange of techniques accompanied by an exchange of ideas. And gradually, impossibly, Naruto began to reach the broken idealist hiding behind Payne's divine facade. The decisive moment came when Nagato, in desperation, attempted to use his ultimate technique, Chibaku Tensei, the gravity manipulation that would create a miniature moon by drawing everything in the surrounding area into a massive sphere of compressed matter. But instead of countering with equal force as Tobirama's strategic instincts suggested, Naruto made a choice that honored both his inherited knowledge and his personal values. He used Flying Thunder God not to escape or deflect the attack, but to teleport directly beside Nagato's hidden location. The real body was exactly what Naruto had expected, emaciated, suffering, kept alive by artificial means and fueled by pain that went far beyond the physical. But his eyes still held traces of the idealistic young man who had once believed in Jiraiya's teachings about peace and understanding. "You could kill me now," Nagato said quietly, his voice hoarse from years of speaking only through puppet bodies. "End the threat, save your village, it would be the logical choice." "Yes," Naruto agreed, his hands gentle as he helped support the frail figure. "It would be logical, strategic, efficient, and completely wrong." Instead of delivering a killing blow, Naruto began using medical ninjutsu, not the advanced techniques he'd learned from Sakura, but older methods that drew on Tobirama's understanding of chakra manipulation for healing rather than destruction. "This is madness," Tobirama's voice protested. "He's responsible for massive civilian casualties." Justice demands that we break the cycle," Naruto replied mentally. "Your way created the conditions that made someone like Payne seem necessary. My way shows that those conditions can be changed." The healing process took hours, complicated by the extensive damage that years of channeling the Rinnegan's power had inflicted on Nagato's body. But gradually, with Konan's tearful assistance and the resources that Naruto's strategic coordination had preserved, the immediate crisis passed. Payne's assault had been stopped not through superior force, but through superior understanding. The village had been protected not by calculating optimal casualty ratios, but by demonstrating that alternatives to violence were possible even in the dire circumstances. But the victory came with costs that went beyond the physical damage to buildings and infrastructure. Naruto's public display of abilities that no genin should possess had created political complications that would reshape his relationship with the village permanently. More troubling was the realization that his success had required him to fully embrace aspects of Tobirama's legacy that he'd been trying to keep at arm's length. The tactical coordination, the strategic thinking, the willingness to make decisions that affected thousands of lives, all of it had felt natural in ways that suggested fundamental changes to his personality. "This is what leadership means," Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto sat in the ruins of what had been Konoha's eastern district. "Making choices that preserve what matters most, even when those choices cost you pieces of yourself." But Naruto looked around at the village he'd helped protect, at the families reuniting, at the medical teams treating wounded civilians, at former enemies working together to rebuild what had been damaged, and felt something that Tobirama's cynical realism had never quite captured. "No," he said quietly, speaking to both his inherited memories and his own doubts. "Leadership means finding ways to preserve everything that matters, the village, the people, the bonds between them, and the ideals that make it all worthwhile." As the sun set over Konoha, casting long shadows across the reconstruction efforts, Naruto carried the weight of newfound understanding. He had successfully integrated Tobirama's strategic brilliance with his own moral compass, creating an approach to leadership that honored both efficiency and compassion. The political ramifications would be significant. His display of high-level jutsu and tactical authority had made his unique situation impossible to hide any longer. Questions would be asked, explanations demanded, and decisions made about his future role in the village's hierarchy. But for the first time since his memories of Tobirama had begun to surface, Naruto felt genuinely confident about his ability to navigate those challenges. He was no longer fighting against his inheritance or being overwhelmed by it. He was consciously choosing which aspects to embrace and which to transcend. The will of fire burned bright within him, fueled by both ancient wisdom and youthful determination. He had learned to wield Tobirama's legacy without being consumed by it, to honor the past while building something better for the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about his identity and capabilities. But tonight, Konoha stood secure not because of superior force or strategic dominance, but because someone had chosen to break cycles of hatred that seemed eternal. In the distance, work crews labored by torchlight to repair damaged buildings and infrastructure. Medical teams moved through evacuation centers, treating injuries and reuniting families. And in quiet conversations throughout the village, people spoke of the young ninja who had faced down a god and convinced him to choose mercy over justice. The legend of Naruto Uzumaki had evolved into something larger, not just the hyperactive genin who dreamed of becoming Hokage, but the inheritor of a complex legacy who had found ways to honor both power and compassion. As he made his way home through streets that hummed with Reconstruction activity, Naruto carried with him the knowledge that leadership was not about choosing between sentiment and effectiveness, but about finding synthesis that transcended both. The hardest battles, he had learned, were not fought with jutsu or strategy, but with the willingness to remain human in the face of forces that demanded you become something else. And in that battle at least, he had achieved something approaching victory. The night was quiet now, filled with the sounds of a village rebuilding itself with renewed purpose. And in that quiet, Naruto found the peace that had eluded both his current self and his previous incarnation, the understanding that some legacies were meant to be transformed rather than simply inherited. The will of fire would continue to burn, but it would be a more complex flame now, tempered by wisdom, informed by experience, and guided by the hard-won knowledge that the greatest strength lay not in the techniques you mastered, but in the choices you made about how to use them. The ruins of Konoha's eastern district looked different in the morning light, not just because of the physical destruction from Payne's assault, but because of what was being built in its place. Where traditional reconstruction would have simply replaced damaged buildings with identical structures, the work crews were implementing designs that Naruto had provided based on Tobirama's urban planning expertise. Wider streets that would allow for better evacuation routes, underground shelters integrated into residential foundations, community centers positioned to serve as coordination points during emergencies. Each innovation drew on lessons learned from decades of conflict, but implemented with a vision of peace that Tobirama had never quite achieved. Naruto stood on a temporary platform overlooking the construction, clipboard in hand, and an expression of focused concentration that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. The village council had been forced to acknowledge his tactical abilities after his performance during the crisis, but they still struggled to understand how a genin could possess such comprehensive knowledge of infrastructure and governance. The commercial district redesign is proceeding ahead of schedule, reported Yamato, the ANBU captain who had been assigned to oversee reconstruction efforts. His wood release abilities made him invaluable for rapid construction, but his analytical mind made him equally useful for understanding the strategic implications of Naruto's proposals. Good, Naruto replied, marking notes on his clipboard with handwriting that had grown more precise over recent weeks. What about the clan district integration project? Yamato's expression tightened slightly. More resistance than expected. Some of the older clan heads are concerned about security implications of mixing residential areas. The euphemism didn't hide the underlying reality. Many of Konoha's established families were uncomfortable with changes that would reduce their traditional isolation and autonomy. The same insularity that had contributed to the Uchiha massacre was now being defended as essential cultural preservation. Classic resistance to systematic reform, Tobirama's voice observed with familiar frustration. Entrenched interests will always oppose changes that threaten their perceived advantages, even when those advantages are creating long-term instability. But Naruto had learned to balance inherited cynicism with his own understanding of human nature. The clan heads weren't necessarily malicious, they were simply afraid of losing identity and security in an uncertain world. Schedule individual meetings with each clan head, he said after considering the problem. Not official negotiations, just conversations. Sometimes the best way to address fear is to understand what's really driving it. Yamato nodded, though his expression suggested doubt about the effectiveness of such a diplomatic approach. And if conversation isn't sufficient, Then we demonstrate the benefits through implementation rather than argument, Naruto replied. The Nara compound has already volunteered to participate in the pilot program. Once other clans see the practical advantages, improved security, better resource sharing, stronger community bonds, opposition should decrease naturally. The strategy combined Tobirama's understanding of political psychology with Naruto's instinctive grasp of how to build trust through shared experience. Rather than forcing change through authority, they would create conditions where change became obviously beneficial. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Shikamaru, whose expression carried the particular weariness that came from dealing with bureaucratic complexities. As the youngest person ever appointed to serve as liaison between the reconstruction efforts and the village administration, he'd been learning firsthand about the challenges of implementing systematic reform. Council meeting in 20 minutes, he announced without preamble. They want to discuss your proposal for Ninja Academy curriculum changes. Naruto felt a familiar tension in his chest. The educational reforms he'd suggested were among the most important aspects of his reconstruction plan, but they were also the most controversial. Traditional training methods had produced generations of capable ninja, and many council members saw no reason to change systems that had proven effective. Opposition arguments? He asked as they began walking toward the administrative district. The usual, Shikamaru replied, too theoretical, too focused on cooperation instead of individual excellence, too radical a departure from proven methods. He paused, studying Naruto's profile with analytical eyes. They're also concerned about the source of your educational expertise. Hard to explain how a genin developed such comprehensive understanding of pedagogical theory. The challenge was one that Naruto faced constantly now. His inherited knowledge far exceeded what any normal 16-year-old could possess, but revealing the full truth about his reincarnation carried political risks that extended beyond personal concerns. I'll handle the questions, he said quietly. Focus on presenting the practical benefits rather than the theoretical foundations. The council chamber buzzed with subdued tension as Naruto entered, accompanied by Shikamaru and several other young ninja who had been instrumental in developing the reconstruction proposals. The older generation of village leadership occupied their traditional positions around the massive table, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Danzo, in particular, radiated disapproval that went beyond simple policy disagreement. His single visible eye tracked Naruto's movements with predatory intensity, and his bandaged fingers drummed against the table in patterns that suggested barely contained impatience. Uzumaki, he said without preamble as soon as everyone was seated. Your proposed changes to the academy curriculum represent a fundamental departure from training methods that have served Konoha for generations. Perhaps you could explain what qualifies you to redesign systems created by far more experienced educators. The challenge was direct and personal, designed to undermine Naruto's credibility by highlighting his youth and supposed lack of relevant experience. It was exactly the kind of political maneuvering that Tobirama had faced countless times during his own tenure in leadership. Respond with facts, not emotions, the inherited voice advised. Demonstrate competence through results rather than defending credentials that don't officially exist. With respect, Danzo-san, Naruto replied, his voice carrying quiet authority. The current academy system has a 67% graduation rate and produces ninja with skill sets that are increasingly mismatched to modern threats. The proposed changes aren't theoretical, they're based on analysis of actual combat performance data from recent conflicts. He gestured to Shikamaru, who activated a presentation scroll that displayed statistical breakdowns of ninja casualties, mission success rates, and skill deficiencies identified through systematic review of after-action reports. Traditional training emphasizes individual technique mastery and clan-specific abilities, Naruto continued. But recent conflicts have demonstrated that success increasingly depends on coordination, adaptability, and integrated problem-solving. Our academy graduates are technically proficient but strategically unprepared. The data was compelling, drawn from Tobirama's understanding of military analysis combined with Naruto's first-hand experience of how modern ninja warfare had evolved. But more importantly, it was presented in language that focused on village security rather than educational theory. Counselor Koharu leaned forward, her aged features creased with concern. Your analysis may be accurate, but implementation of such comprehensive changes would require resources that are already stretched thin by reconstruction efforts. Actually, Shikamaru interjected, the proposed changes would reduce overall training costs while improving graduation rates. By emphasizing collaborative learning and integrated skill development, we can achieve better results with more efficient resource allocation. The conversation that followed was detailed and sometimes contentious, covering everything from curriculum design to instructor training to assessment methodologies. But gradually, Naruto could see attitudes beginning to shift as the practical benefits became clear. His proposals weren't radical departures from tradition. They were evolutionary improvements that honored the village's educational heritage while adapting to changing strategic requirements. More importantly, they were designed to prevent the kinds of systemic failures that had contributed to past tragedies. This is how change happens, he realized with growing understanding. Not through dramatic revolution, but through patient demonstration that new approaches serve established values more effectively than old methods. The breakthrough came when Sunnade herself entered the chamber, her presence immediately commanding attention from all assembled council members. "I've been reviewing the preliminary results from the pilot programs," she announced, settling into her chair at the head of the table. "The mixed clan training exercises have produced coordination improvements that exceed our most optimistic projections." She activated another presentation scroll, this one showing footage from recent training sessions where young ninja from different clans had been working together on complex scenarios. The level of cooperation and tactical sophistication was remarkable, clearly superior to what individual clan training typically achieved. More importantly, Sunnade continued, the participating families report improved relationships and reduced interclan tensions. The Akim, Ichi, and Yamanaka have begun joint resource sharing for the first time in decades. The Inuzuka and Aburame are collaborating on tracking techniques that combine their respective specialties. The implications were staggering. If the educational reforms could successfully break down the clan-based divisions that had plagued Konoha for generations, the village would emerge from Reconstruction stronger and more unified than ever before. The question, Danzo said with obvious reluctance, is whether these improvements can be sustained and expanded without compromising the specialized knowledge that makes each clan valuable. It was a reasonable concern, but one that Naruto had anticipated based on Tobirama's experience with similar integration challenges. "The clan specializations aren't being eliminated," he explained patiently. "They're being enhanced through exposure to complementary techniques and perspectives. A Hyuga student who understands Nara tactical theory becomes more effective at using Byakugan for strategic reconnaissance. An Uchiha who trains with Akim Ichi partners learns to maximize sharing and advantages in team combat scenarios." "And what about clan secrets?" pressed another council member. "Techniques that are meant to remain within family lines, protected through graduated access protocols," Shikamaru replied. "Basic cooperation and coordination training doesn't require sharing advanced clan techniques. Students learn to work together effectively while maintaining appropriate boundaries around sensitive knowledge." The system they were describing balanced transparency with security, collaboration with specialization, progress with tradition. It was exactly the kind of nuanced approach that political systems required but rarely achieved. As the discussion continued, Naruto found himself drawing on both aspects of his inherited experience. Tobirama's systematic understanding of governance, combined with his own intuitive grasp of how to build consensus around shared goals. By the time the meeting concluded, the academy reforms had been approved for expanded implementation, along with several related initiatives that would reshape how Konoha approached everything from mission assignments to resource allocation. But the most significant victory wasn't the policy changes themselves. It was the demonstration that systematic reform was possible when approached with patience, competence, and genuine concern for village welfare. Walking back through the Reconstruction zones after the council meeting, Naruto felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple political success. For the first time since his memories of Tobirama had begun to surface, he felt like he was truly honoring his predecessor's legacy while remaining true to his own values. "This is what I was meant to accomplish," he realized with sudden clarity. Not just inheriting Tobirama's knowledge, but using it to build something better than either of us could have achieved alone. The insight was interrupted by the arrival of Sasuke, who emerged from the shadows between damaged buildings with the fluid grace that marked elite ninja movement. His expression was troubled, carrying the weight of someone dealing with internal conflicts that had no easy resolution. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, "about what you said during the Payne attack, about reincarnation and inherited memories." Naruto felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. He'd been expecting this conversation since the crisis had passed, but that didn't make it any easier to contemplate. How could he explain the full truth about his situation without destroying the friendship that had always been central to his identity? "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. "Everything," Sasuke replied with characteristic directness. "No more half-truths or evasions. If we're going to rebuild trust between us, it has to be based on complete honesty." They found a private space in one of the less damaged training grounds, away from the reconstruction crews and administrative bustle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scarred earth, creating an atmosphere that felt appropriate for conversations about legacies and inherited burdens. "You remember being someone else," Sasuke said once they were settled. "Not just techniques or knowledge, but actual experiences from another lifetime." "Yes," Naruto confirmed. "Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage. His memories have been surfacing gradually since the Chunin exams, becoming clearer and more complete with each passing week. And these memories include information about my clan. About the policies that led to our isolation and eventual massacre." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither could fully process. Naruto nodded slowly, understanding that his friend was asking for truths that would be painful for both of them. "Tobirama created the police force as a way to honor the Uchiha while keeping them contained," he said quietly. "It seemed logical at the time, give them positions of authority and respect while ensuring their activities remained focused on village affairs rather than external politics. But containment became isolation," Sasuke said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Honor became suspicion, until my father felt like he had no choice but to plan a coup." "Yes," Naruto admitted, the guilt in his voice carrying the weight of another lifetime's mistakes. "Every policy decision was well-intentioned, but they created exactly the conditions they were meant to prevent." Sasuke was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that challenged everything he'd believed about his family's history and his own place in the village. "Do you blame yourself?" he asked finally. "For what happened to my clan?" The question cut to the heart of Naruto's internal struggle with his inherited memories. How much responsibility did he bear for decisions made by someone else in another lifetime? "I blame the system that made those decisions seem necessary," he replied carefully. "And I'm determined to change that system so it never happens again." "Is that why you're pushing so hard for these reforms? Because you feel guilty about something that happened before you were born?" "Partly," Naruto admitted. "But mostly because I've seen what happens when fear and suspicion guide policy decisions. The village becomes weaker, not stronger. People get hurt who should have been protected." Sasuke studied his friend's face with the intensity that marked his clan's bloodline, searching for deception or hidden motives. What he found instead was the same fundamental decency that had always characterized Naruto, now informed by wisdom that went beyond his years. "I understand why you didn't tell me earlier," he said eventually. "This knowledge. It changes everything between us, doesn't it?" "It doesn't have to," Naruto replied with quiet conviction. "You're still my friend, my teammate, my rival. The person I am now is built on that foundation, not on memories of someone else's mistakes. But you also carry the responsibility for correcting those mistakes." "We carry that responsibility," Naruto corrected gently. "This isn't something I can fix alone, and it's not something that should be fixed by someone who doesn't understand what it cost your family." The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd ever had, not the competitive banter of rivals or the emotional confrontations of the past, but the careful negotiation of two young men trying to build a relationship that could survive the weight of inherited trauma. Sasuke spoke of growing up with the pressure of being the sole survivor of his clan, of carrying expectations and burdens that had shaped every aspect of his identity. Naruto shared the disorienting experience of remembering decisions and policies from Tobirama's perspective while feeling the guilt and responsibility of their consequences. But more importantly, they began planning together, identifying specific changes that could prevent similar tragedies, developing strategies for implementing reforms without triggering the same defensive reactions that had doomed previous attempts at integration. "The new academy programs," Sasuke observed, "they're designed to break down the clan barriers that created the isolation in the first place." "Among other things," Naruto confirmed. "But change has to come from within the clans as well as from village policy. That's where your influence could be crucial." "My influence?" Sasuke's laugh was bitter. "I'm the last Uchiha." "What influence could I possibly have?" "You're the last Uchiha who chose to stay loyal to the village despite having every reason to leave," Naruto corrected. "That means something to people. It demonstrates that the bonds between clans and village can survive even the worst betrayals." The insight seemed to surprise Sasuke, who had never considered his choice to remain in Konoha as anything more than personal preference. But from Naruto's perspective, informed by Tobirama's understanding of political symbolism, Sasuke's presence was a powerful statement about the possibility of reconciliation and renewal. As the sun began to set over the reconstruction efforts, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the two friends found themselves planning initiatives that would have been impossible without their combined perspectives. Sasuke's first-hand experience of clan dynamics combined with Naruto's inherited knowledge of village systems to create strategies that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. "There's something else," Naruto said as they prepared to part ways. "The intelligence networks that Tobirama established, some of them are still active, still reporting to dead drops that haven't been checked in decades. If we can access that information, we might be able to identify other threats before they fully develop." The implications were staggering. If Tobirama had left behind comprehensive intelligence resources, they could gain strategic advantages that went far beyond individual technique mastery or tactical knowledge. "Do you know where these dead drops are located?" Sasuke asked. "Some of them," Naruto replied, "but accessing them safely will require careful planning. Some of the security measures Tobirama implemented were extreme." That evening, as Konoha settled into the routine of reconstruction and renewal, Naruto found himself in the hidden laboratory beneath the village foundations once again. But this time he wasn't alone. Sasuke accompanied him, along with Shikamaru and several other trusted friends who had been carefully briefed on selected aspects of his unique situation. The intelligence archives that Tobirama had established were more extensive than any of them had imagined. Files on potential threats that wouldn't manifest for decades, detailed analyses of political trends in neighboring countries, strategic assessments of technological developments that could reshape the ninja world. But most importantly, evidence that other reincarnations might be active, spiritual signatures that suggested souls carrying memories from previous lifetimes, some serving village interests and others representing potential threats. "Hashirama's spiritual resonance has been detected near the land of Earth," Shikamaru read from one of the more recent intelligence reports. "Associated with unusual vegetation growth patterns and reports of advanced wood release techniques." "And here," Sasuke added, pointing to another file, "possible Madara reincarnation in the Land of Lightning. Timeline suggests activation coincided with recent political instability in Hidden Cloud." The pattern was becoming clear. The spiritual disturbances that had triggered Naruto's awakening were part of a larger phenomenon, one that could reshape the balance of power between villages if not properly understood and managed. "We need to establish contact with other reincarnations," Naruto decided after reviewing the available intelligence. "Not for confrontation, but for coordination. If souls are returning to address unfinished business, we should work together rather than risk repeating the conflicts that ended our previous lives." It was a bold strategy, one that required trust and cooperation on a scale that the ninja world had rarely achieved. But it was also the logical extension of everything they'd been working toward, breaking cycles of hatred and suspicion that had perpetuated conflict for generations. As they planned their approach to this larger challenge, Naruto felt the familiar weight of inherited responsibility settling on his shoulders. But for the first time since his memories had begun to surface, that weight felt manageable, not because the burden was lighter, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. The will of fire burned bright within him, fueled by both ancient wisdom and youthful determination. He had learned to honor Tobirama's legacy while transcending its limitations, to build on past achievements while correcting past mistakes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: contact with other reincarnations, navigation of complex international politics, preparation for conflicts that spanned multiple lifetimes. But tonight, there was the satisfaction of meaningful progress, the warmth of renewed friendships, and the promise of a future that honored both the past and present. In the distance, Konoha's lights flickered like stars against the darkness, each one representing a life protected by their efforts. The village was stronger now, not just because of improved defenses or more efficient training, but because of bonds that transcended clan divisions and policies that prioritized unity over control. The cycle was finally breaking, replaced by something better. And in that breaking, Naruto found the peace that had eluded both his current self and his previous incarnation. The understanding that some legacies were meant to be transformed rather than simply preserved. The night was quiet now, filled with the sounds of a village building its future on foundations that honored the past while reaching towards something greater. And in that quiet, the will of fire burned on, carried by those who had learned that the greatest strength lay not in the techniques they inherited, but in the wisdom to use them in service of bonds that transcended individual lifetimes. The intelligence reached Konoha through multiple channels simultaneously, a convergence of reports that painted a picture so dire that even veteran ninja struggled to process its implications. The Fourth Great Ninja War had begun not with formal declarations or territorial disputes, but with the systematic resurrection of legendary warriors whose names were etched into the darkest chapters of shinobi history. Naruto stood in the Hokage's emergency command center, surrounded by maps, communication devices, and the grim faces of people who had hoped never to see conflict on this scale again. The room hummed with controlled chaos as intelligence analysts processed reports from across the elemental nations, each piece of information adding another layer to a nightmare that seemed impossible to comprehend. Confirmed sightings of impure world reincarnation subjects in all major theaters, reported Shikaku Nara, his usually calm demeanor strained by the magnitude of what they were facing. The Gold and Silver brothers near the border of Lightning Country, the 7 ninja swordsmen moving through Mist territory, even some of the previous Kage. The last revelation sent a chill through the assembled leadership. Bringing back individual legendary warriors was one thing, but reanimating former village leaders represented a level of strategic planning that suggested their enemy understood both the psychological and tactical implications of their actions. Sunnade leaned forward over the central table, her hands pressed flat against maps that showed troop movements across 3 continents. What about the mastermind behind this? Any progress on identifying who has the capability to coordinate something of this magnitude? Working on it, replied Inoichi Yamanaka, the head of the intelligence division. But whoever it is has resources that dwarf anything we've seen before. The chakra expenditure alone for this many simultaneous reincarnations should be impossible for any single individual. Naruto felt Tobirama's analytical mind engaging automatically, processing the strategic implications with cold efficiency that his own emotional nature found disturbing. Multiple theater coordination, resource allocation suggesting either a group effort or access to external chakra sources, psychological warfare through familiar faces. Classic destabilization doctrine create emotional confusion among enemy forces while demonstrating overwhelming power. But what troubled him more than the tactical analysis was the personal knowledge that came with it. As the creator of Impure World Reincarnation, Tobirama understood the technique's limitations and potential applications better than anyone else alive. And that knowledge painted an even darker picture than the intelligence reports suggested. There's something else, Naruto said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had become natural over recent months. Whoever is doing this has access to detailed intelligence about the reincarnated individuals, their techniques, their personalities, their relationships with people still alive. This isn't just resurrection, it's psychological warfare designed to exploit specific emotional vulnerabilities. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Fighting legendary warriors was one challenge, but fighting them while they retained the faces and voices of beloved teachers, family members, or respected enemies represented a completely different level of cruelty. "You sound like you know this technique personally," observed Danzo from his position at the edge of the group, his single visible eye studying Naruto with uncomfortable intensity. The comment was meant as an accusation, but Naruto met it directly. The time for hiding his full capabilities was over. The scale of this conflict would require everything he could contribute, regardless of political complications. "I do know it personally," he admitted, his voice steady despite the weight of revelation. "Because I created it in a previous life as a tool for battlefield intelligence gathering. It was never intended for mass warfare or psychological manipulation." The silence that followed was deafening. Even those who had suspected the truth of his reincarnation were unprepared for such a direct confirmation of his identity as Tobirama's successor. It was the fourth Hokage who broke the tension with characteristic bluntness. "Previous life or not, can you counter it?" Naruto considered the question with both his current understanding and inherited knowledge. "Counter it completely? No. The technique draws on pure chakra manipulation and soul binding that can't be disrupted by conventional means. But I can limit its effectiveness, provide intelligence about the reincarnated individual's capabilities, and potentially turn some of them back to our side through targeted psychological intervention." "Explain," Sunnade commanded, her medical training making her particularly interested in techniques that manipulated life and death. What followed was a detailed briefing that combined Tobirama's intimate knowledge of the jutsu with Naruto's understanding of modern tactical applications. He explained how the reincarnated bodies were maintained, their limitations and advantages, the psychological factors that could influence their behavior even while under external control. But more importantly, he outlined a strategic response that went beyond simple military tactics to address the deeper implications of fighting an enemy who could weaponize their own history. The key vulnerability, Naruto explained as he moved around the tactical display, isn't technical, it's emotional. The reincarnated individuals retain their personalities and memories. That means they can be reached, reasoned with, even turned against their controller if the approach is correct. "And you propose to do this while coordinating our overall military response?" asked Mifune, the samurai leader whose Iron Country had agreed to serve as neutral ground for the Allied forces' headquarters. "Not just me," Naruto replied, gesturing to include several of his peers. "This kind of conflict requires distributed leadership and specialized teams. I can provide strategic coordination and handle specific reincarnations who might respond to someone carrying Tobirama's memories. But others will be better suited for different aspects of the campaign." The strategy session that followed lasted 18 hours, covering everything from supply logistics to communication protocols to specialized engagement rules for different categories of reincarnated opponents. By the time they concluded, the framework for the Allied shinobi forces had been established, along with command structures that would coordinate the largest military operation in recorded ninja history. But for Naruto, the most significant development was the formal recognition of his tactical authority. The Council of Kage had designated him as Chief Strategic Coordinator, a position that acknowledged both his inherited expertise and his unique insights into the enemy's capabilities. "This is what leadership during wartime actually means," Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto reviewed the final operational plans. "Not the peaceful administration you've been practicing, but life and death decisions that affect thousands of people across multiple battlefields." The weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming, but Naruto drew strength from the relationships he'd built and the reforms he'd implemented. The village he was helping to protect was stronger than the one Tobirama had known, more unified, more trusting, more capable of adapting to unprecedented challenges. 3 days later, the Allied forces began deploying to their assigned theaters, and the true scope of the enemy's strategy became clear. The reincarnated warriors weren't just random selections of powerful individuals. They had been chosen specifically to maximize psychological impact on the people most likely to oppose them. In Lightning Country, the Gold and Silver brothers faced Cloud Ninja who remembered their betrayal of the second Hokage. In Mist Territory, the 7 ninja swordsmen confronted the current generation who had grown up hearing stories of their legendary cruelty. And in the most painful irony of all, former Kage were being deployed against their own villages, forcing students to fight their beloved teachers. The reports that reached Naruto at the Allied forces' headquarters painted a picture of confusion and demoralization that threatened to undermine their military effectiveness before the real fighting had even begun. Classic psychological warfare, Tobirama's analytical mind noted. Degrade enemy morale through emotional manipulation, then exploit the resulting confusion with conventional attacks. Whoever is coordinating this understands both the technical and psychological aspects of large-scale conflict. But Naruto's response drew on lessons that went beyond military strategy. Instead of trying to shield his forces from emotional manipulation, he chose to address it directly through the communication networks he'd helped establish. His first message to all Allied forces was broadcast simultaneously across every theater. To all Allied shinobi forces, this is Strategic Coordinator Naruto Uzumaki. I know that many of you are facing opponents who wear familiar faces, teachers you respected, family members you loved, heroes you admired. This is not coincidence. Our enemy chose these specific individuals because they knew it would cause you pain and confusion. I want you to remember that the people you're seeing are not your loved ones returned to you. They are echoes, shadows of the past being manipulated by someone who wants to use your emotions against you. The real honor we can show these individuals is to prevent their memories from being used as weapons. You have permission to feel grief, anger, confusion. These are natural responses to an unnatural situation. But don't let those feelings paralyze you. The best way to honor the dead is to protect the living, and that means fighting with everything we have while staying true to the values they taught us. Remember, we fight not just for victory, but for the right to choose our own path forward. That's what every previous generation died to protect, and it's what we must preserve for the next. The message was followed by specific tactical guidance for each theater, drawing on Naruto's inherited knowledge of the reincarnated individual's capabilities and psychological profiles. But more importantly, it established a tone that acknowledged emotional difficulty while maintaining operational focus. The effect was immediate and measurable. Reports from field commanders indicated improved morale and tactical cohesion, along with several successful engagements where Allied forces had managed to neutralize reincarnated opponents through the psychological approaches that Naruto had outlined. But the real test came when he faced his first reincarnated opponent personally. The encounter occurred during a reconnaissance mission in the borderlands between Fire and Earth Country, where intelligence suggested the enemy was establishing a major staging area. Naruto had volunteered for the mission despite protests from his command staff. His unique insights made him too valuable to risk in direct combat, they argued. But sometimes leadership required personal presence, and this was one of those situations. The abandoned mining complex where they'd tracked the enemy activity looked normal from a distance, but Naruto's enhanced senses could detect the wrongness that permeated the area. Chakra signatures that felt familiar but twisted, the spiritual residue of techniques that violated the natural order between life and death. Contact, reported Neji, his Byakugan revealing details that normal vision couldn't perceive. Multiple individuals, but their chakra networks are artificial, definitely reincarnated subjects. Naruto nodded, his hands already moving to the kunai that would allow Flying Thunder God deployment if retreat became necessary. But as the enemy figures became visible, he felt his chest constrict with emotions that transcended strategic concerns. The third Hokage, A's father, stood at the center of the group with the imposing presence that had made him legendary even among Kage. Beside him was Mew, the second Tsuchikage, whose invisibility techniques had revolutionized stealth warfare. And behind them both, Hiruzen, Naruto whispered, his voice breaking slightly as he recognized his surrogate grandfather. The third Hokage looked exactly as he had in life, though his eyes held the dull emptiness that marked all reincarnated subjects under external control. Seeing him like this, reduced to a puppet wearing the face of someone who had shown Naruto unconditional love and guidance, was almost unbearable. This is what the enemy wanted, Tobirama's voice observed with clinical detachment. Maximum psychological impact through the most emotionally devastating matchup possible. Facing your teacher, your father figure, the person whose approval you most wanted. But even as the inherited analysis provided tactical understanding, Naruto felt his resolve strengthening rather than weakening. This wasn't just about military strategy anymore, it was about protecting the memory and dignity of people who deserved better than to be used as weapons. "Everyone stay back," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This requires a specific approach that I need to handle personally." The battle that followed was unlike anything Naruto had experienced in either lifetime. Fighting the third Hokage required him to counter techniques he'd learned from the man himself, to anticipate strategies that Hiruzen had used during their own training sessions. Every attack carried emotional weight beyond its tactical significance. But what made the encounter truly challenging was Naruto's refusal to treat his opponent as just another enemy. Instead of using overwhelming force or exploiting the limitations of the reincarnated body, he fought defensively while attempting to reach the consciousness that might still exist beneath the external control. "Hiruzen Jiasen," he called out during a lull in the combat, his voice carrying across the battlefield with desperate hope. "I know you're in there somewhere. I know this isn't what you wanted." For just a moment, the third Hokage's attacks hesitated, and something that might have been recognition flickered in his eyes. But then the external control reasserted itself, and the assault resumed with renewed intensity. "Sentiment will get you killed," Tobirama's voice warned. "The reincarnated subject is being controlled by someone else's will. Whatever remains of the original personality is trapped, unable to influence the body's actions." But Naruto ignored the inherited pragmatism, trusting instead in the bonds that had always been his greatest strength. If there was even a chance of reaching Hiruzen's true self, he had to try, not because it was tactically optimal, but because it was the right thing to do. The breakthrough came when the third Hokage moved to attack Naruto's teammates, forcing him to make the same kind of protective choice that had defined his relationship with Hiruzen since childhood. Without thinking, he threw himself between the massive ninja and his friends, using his own body to absorb an attack that could have killed any of them. The sight of his sacrifice, the willingness to give everything for his companions, seemed to trigger something deep within Hiruzen's constrained consciousness. For a critical moment, the third Hokage's own protective instincts overcame the external control, allowing him to break free long enough to speak. "Naruto," he said, his voice carrying all the warmth and pride that had characterized their relationship. "You've grown into everything I hoped you would become, but you need to understand this technique can't be broken by sentiment alone. You'll need to..." The control reasserted itself before he could finish, but he'd said enough. In that brief moment of connection, Hiruzen had managed to convey crucial information about the reincarnation technique's vulnerabilities, guidance that only someone experiencing it from the inside could provide. Armed with this knowledge, Naruto was able to develop a new approach that combined tactical effectiveness with emotional honesty. Instead of trying to free the reincarnated subjects completely, he focused on disrupting their controller's hold long enough for their true personalities to influence their actions. The strategy worked, but at significant personal cost. Each successful intervention required Naruto to open himself emotionally to people who were simultaneously beloved and dangerous, to maintain hope and compassion in the face of techniques specifically designed to cause despair. By the time the engagement concluded, he had successfully neutralized 3 reincarnated Kage without causing permanent harm to their spiritual essence. But the effort had left him drained in ways that went beyond simple chakra expenditure. "This is unsustainable," Tobirama's voice observed as they made their way back to headquarters. "You cannot carry the emotional burden of every reincarnated subject we encounter. The psychological toll will compromise your strategic effectiveness." "Maybe," Naruto replied quietly, his voice hoarse from emotional and physical exhaustion. "But if we lose our humanity in the process of winning this war, what exactly are we preserving?" The question went to the heart of everything he'd been struggling with since his memories had begun to surface. How much of himself could he sacrifice for tactical advantage before he became something his friends wouldn't recognize? How much pragmatism could he embrace before he lost the bonds that made his life meaningful? The answer, he was beginning to understand, lay not in choosing between effectiveness and compassion, but in finding synthesis that honored both. The war would require difficult decisions and strategic thinking, but it would also require the kind of emotional courage that military doctrine couldn't teach. As they approached the Allied Forces headquarters, where reports from other theaters waited to be analyzed and new missions planned, Naruto carried with him both the satisfaction of tactical success and the weight of inherited wisdom. The Fourth Great Ninja War had begun with an enemy strategy designed to exploit their emotional connections and historical relationships. But perhaps those same connections could be turned from vulnerabilities into strengths, from weaknesses to be protected into weapons that could win not just battles, but the peace that would follow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new reincarnated opponents, new tests of his ability to balance strategic necessity with personal values. Tonight, there was the quiet satisfaction of having reached across the barrier between life and death to touch the spirit of someone he loved, and the hope that such connections might be the key to victory in a war where the stakes went far beyond territorial control. The will of fire burned within him, fueled by both ancient knowledge and youthful determination. But it was a more complex flame now, one that could provide both the cold light of strategic analysis and the warm glow of human connection, depending on what the situation required. In the distance, communication fires flickered across the landscape like earthbound stars, carrying orders and intelligence between scattered forces. Each light represented lives under his coordination, people who trusted his strategic judgment and moral guidance. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but it was also clarifying. This was what leadership meant, not just making optimal tactical decisions, but ensuring that those decisions served values worth preserving. And in that understanding, Naruto found the synthesis between his inherited knowledge and personal nature that would carry him through whatever darkness lay ahead. The war was far from over, but for the first time since it began, he felt confident that they could win it without losing themselves in the process. The question was whether that confidence would survive contact with enemies who understood their emotional vulnerabilities as well as their tactical ones. Only time would tell, but tonight, in the quiet moments between crises, Naruto allowed himself to hope that the bonds forged in peace might prove stronger than the weapons forged in war. The Allied Forces headquarters buzzed with controlled urgency as reports flooded in from across all theaters of the war. What had begun as a coordinated defense against reincarnated legends had evolved into something far more complex, a conflict that threatened to reshape not just the balance of power between villages, but the fundamental nature of chakra itself. Naruto stood before the massive tactical display, his eyes tracking the convergence of enemy forces toward a single point that made his blood run cold. Every piece of intelligence, every strategic movement, every seemingly random redeployment was pointing toward the same terrifying conclusion. "They're not trying to win the war through conventional means," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had become second nature over the past weeks. This entire conflict has been a distraction, a way to gather chakra and position resources for something much larger. Sunnade looked up from the communication scrolls scattered across her desk, her medical training making her particularly attuned to the exhaustion that lined Naruto's features. He'd been coordinating multiple theaters simultaneously for days, using Flying Thunder God to personally oversee critical engagements while maintaining strategic oversight of the entire campaign. "Explain," she commanded, though her tone carried concern as well as professional interest. The analysis that followed drew on both Tobirama's systematic understanding of large-scale conflicts and Naruto's intuitive grasp of the spiritual forces that shaped the ninja world. As he outlined the enemy's true objectives, the assembled leadership felt a chill that went beyond tactical concern. The reincarnated individuals, the massive chakra expenditures, the coordinated assaults on all major villages. None of it was meant to achieve military victory, Naruto continued, his hands moving across the display to highlight connection patterns that wouldn't have been visible to anyone lacking his unique perspective. It was all designed to weaken the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of chakra itself. Classic misdirection strategy, Tobirama's voice observed with grim appreciation. Create obvious threats to distract from the true objective. But this scale of manipulation suggests resources and planning that extend far beyond any individual we've encountered. The inherited analysis was accompanied by fragments of memory that made Naruto's chest constrict with recognition. Ancient stories passed down through the Senju clan, legends about the origin of chakra and the beings who had first wielded it. Knowledge that had seemed like mythology was suddenly, terrifyingly relevant. "Kaguya," he whispered, the name carrying weight that seemed to make the air itself heavy. "The rabbit goddess. The mother of chakra." Shikamaru looked up from his own analytical work, his expression troubled. "That's just a legend, isn't it? Stories to explain where chakra came from originally." But Naruto was accessing memories that went deeper than Tobirama's lifetime, touching spiritual knowledge that had been passed down through generations of those who had shaped the ninja world's foundations. "Not just a legend," he replied, his voice carrying certainty that chilled everyone present. "The source, the original wielder of chakra who was sealed away by her own sons because her power had grown beyond all control or comprehension." The briefing that followed was unlike anything the Allied forces' leadership had experienced. Naruto outlined a threat that transcended conventional military understanding, an entity whose resurrection would fundamentally alter the relationship between humanity and the spiritual forces that shaped their world. But more troubling than the scale of the threat was the realization that conventional tactical responses would be utterly inadequate. Fighting someone who existed partially outside normal reality required strategies that combined spiritual understanding with tactical brilliance in ways that no military doctrine had ever contemplated. "How do we fight someone like that?" asked the fourth Hokage, his direct nature cutting through the theoretical complexities to the practical heart of the matter. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, accessing knowledge that felt both ancient and immediate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what would be required. "We don't fight her directly, not initially. Her power in a straightforward confrontation would be overwhelming. Instead, we create conditions where her abilities can be contained, limited, turned against themselves." He paused, drawing on strategic principles that combined Tobirama's systematic thinking with insights that seemed to come from even deeper sources. But more importantly, we remember that she wasn't defeated through superior force the first time. She was sealed by people who understood her on a personal level, who saw past the power to the individual underneath. That's our real advantage, not our ability to match her strength, but our capacity to reach the humanity that might still exist beneath layers of divine power. Dangerous assumption, Tobirama's voice warned. Entities of that scale often transcend individual personality entirely. Emotional appeals may be ineffective or actively counterproductive. But Naruto's own experience had taught him that even the most overwhelmingly powerful individuals retain traces of their original nature. Payne had been reached through understanding his fundamental motivations. The reincarnated Kage had responded to approaches that honored their core identities. If Kaguya could be approached as a person rather than just a force of nature, there might be alternatives to the kind of mutual destruction that traditional military thinking would suggest. The strategic planning that followed was the most complex undertaking Naruto had ever coordinated. Multiple contingencies had to be prepared simultaneously: direct confrontation if diplomacy failed, sealing protocols if containment became necessary, evacuation procedures if the conflict threatened civilian populations beyond their ability to protect. But underlying all the tactical considerations was a deeper challenge: how to maintain the values and bonds that made their civilization worth preserving while preparing for a battle that might require them to sacrifice everything they held dear. This is what leadership during existential crisis actually means, Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto reviewed the final deployment orders. Making decisions that balance immediate survival against long-term principles, knowing that either choice might lead to outcomes too terrible to contemplate. The observation was accurate, but Naruto had learned to balance inherited pragmatism with his own moral instincts. The war had taught him that effective strategy could serve humanitarian values rather than opposing them if approached with sufficient creativity and determination. 3 days later, the conflict reached its climax in a location that seemed chosen specifically for its symbolic significance: the Valley of the End, where Hashirama and Madara had once fought their legendary battle. But the combatants now were far beyond anything those earlier conflicts had contemplated. Madara Uchiha stood at the center of a transformed landscape, his body merged with the Ten Tails in a fusion that radiated power on a scale that dwarfed anything Naruto had experienced. But even that overwhelming presence felt diminished compared to the spatial distortions that marked Kaguya's imminent arrival. Classic escalation pattern, Tobirama's analytical mind noted with clinical detachment. Each stage of the conflict reveals powers that make the previous level seem insignificant by comparison. The question is whether our strategic preparations can adapt to threats that exceed our planning assumptions. But Naruto was no longer relying solely on inherited tactical knowledge. The months of integrating Tobirama's memories with his own experiences had created something new, a synthesis that combined systematic strategic thinking with intuitive understanding of the spiritual forces that shaped their world. As he took his position at the center of the Allied forces formation, surrounded by the friends and allies who had followed him through impossible circumstances, Naruto felt a clarity that went beyond simple confidence. This was what all his training, all his growth, all his struggle to balance competing aspects of his nature had been preparing him for. The battle that followed was conducted on multiple levels simultaneously: physical confrontation with entities whose power transcended normal comprehension, strategic coordination of forces across a battlefield that kept shifting between dimensions, and spiritual conflict with beings who existed partially outside conventional reality. But what made it more than just an escalating exchange of increasingly devastating techniques was Naruto's refusal to abandon the approach that had always served him best. Even while wielding Tobirama's most advanced jutsu, even while coordinating military operations that involved thousands of ninja, he continued to look for ways to reach the individuals beneath layers of divine power. "You're approaching this wrong," Tobirama's voice warned as Naruto prepared to engage Kaguya directly. Entities of this scale respond to demonstration of superior force, not emotional appeals. Show her that resistance is futile, and she may choose to retreat rather than risk destruction. But Naruto's own experience had taught him that overwhelming power often masked deep vulnerability. The strongest opponents he'd faced, Payne, Sasuke during his defection, even some of the reincarnated Kage, had been driven by pain and loss that could be addressed if approached with sufficient understanding. "Kaguya," he called out across the transformed battlefield, his voice carrying with chakra enhancement that made it audible despite the chaos surrounding them. "I know you're afraid. I know you feel like power is the only thing that can protect what you care about, but there are other ways." The rabbit goddess paused in her assault, her pale eyes focusing on him with something that might have been surprise. For a moment, the overwhelming presence that radiated from her form seemed to flicker, revealing glimpses of the individual who had once been human enough to bear children and form relationships. "You carry the presence of one who opposed me before," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "Yet you speak of understanding rather than conquest. Why?" The question opened the door for the kind of conversation that Naruto had been hoping for. An exchange that went beyond the immediate tactical situation to address the underlying forces that had created the conflict. "Because I've learned that power without connection leads to isolation, and isolation leads to fear, and fear leads to choices that destroy everything you're trying to protect," he replied, his words drawing on hard-won wisdom from both his current life and inherited memories. What followed was a negotiation conducted while reality itself shifted around them. A diplomatic exchange that took place between moments of combat that could have reshaped continents. But gradually, impossibly, Naruto began to reach something in Kaguya that responded to understanding rather than force. The breakthrough came when he was able to demonstrate that the world she sought to control had evolved beyond her original understanding, that the chakra she had given to humanity had grown into something larger and more complex than even she could have anticipated. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the allied forces who had followed him into impossible danger. People from every village, every clan, every bloodline working together because they chose to rather than because they were compelled to. "The power you gave us has become something greater than domination. It's become connection." For a crucial moment, Kaguya's overwhelming presence softened, her ancient fear giving way to something that might have been wonder. The chakra that had seemed so alien and threatening began to resonate with more familiar patterns, aligning itself with the spiritual network that connected all living things. But the moment of understanding was interrupted by Madara's desperate intervention. Realizing that his plans for infinite Tsukuyomi were being undermined by diplomacy rather than force, he launched a final assault designed to shatter the delicate connection that was forming between Kaguya and the allied forces. The attack forced Naruto to make the choice that had been building throughout the entire conflict, between the pragmatic approach that Tobirama's memories suggested and the idealistic path that his own nature demanded. Eliminate the disruptive element Tobirama's tactical instincts urged. Madara's interference threatens the negotiated solution. Remove him permanently and the larger crisis can be resolved diplomatically. But Naruto looked at his former enemy, driven by the same fear and loss that had motivated so many of the opponents he'd faced, and made a different choice. Instead of using overwhelming force to eliminate Madara, he extended the same understanding that had reached Kaguya. The approach that acknowledged pain and offered alternatives to the cycle of hatred that had driven so much conflict. "You wanted to create a world without suffering," he said to Madara, even as he deflected attacks that could have leveled mountains. "I understand that, but the world you were trying to create wouldn't have been real. It would have been a dream where people couldn't choose their own connections." The conversation that followed was brief but decisive. Madara, confronted with evidence that his methods had become divorced from his original goals, found himself forced to reconsider assumptions that had driven him for decades. And in that moment of reconsideration, something shifted in the fundamental balance of the conflict. Instead of three-way combat between overwhelming forces, the confrontation became a collaboration, former enemies working together to address the underlying conditions that had made their conflict seem inevitable. The sealing of Kaguya was accomplished not through superior force, but through combined effort that honored both her power and her essential nature. The technique that Naruto developed drew on Tobirama's understanding of space-time manipulation, but applied it in ways that preserved rather than destroyed the spiritual connections that made their world meaningful. When the dust settled and the immediate crisis had passed, Naruto found himself in the strange position of having won a war without actually defeating his opponents. Kaguya had been convinced to enter a state of voluntary containment that preserved her power while limiting its potential for destruction. Madara had chosen to support the negotiated solution rather than pursue his original objectives. Most importantly, the Allied forces had demonstrated that cooperation could achieve results that individual strength could never approach. Unexpected outcome, Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto surveyed the transformed battlefield where former enemies were now working together to stabilize dimensional distortions. "Your approach succeeded despite violating fundamental principles of tactical doctrine. Maybe that's because fundamental principles sometimes need to be updated," Naruto replied, speaking as much to his inherited memories as to the current situation. "Power isn't the only thing that shapes how conflicts get resolved." The observation marked a crucial evolution in his understanding of leadership. He had learned to honor Tobirama's strategic brilliance while transcending its limitations, to build on inherited knowledge while remaining true to his own values. As the Allied forces began the complex process of transitioning from wartime operations to reconstruction and renewal, Naruto found himself in conversation with the spectral presences of previous Hokage who had materialized to witness the conflict's resolution. "You did something I never managed," Tobirama's spirit said, his red eyes holding approval that transcended simple tactical assessment. "You found ways to preserve both effectiveness and idealism, to achieve strategic objectives while maintaining moral principles." "I learned from your mistakes," Naruto replied with quiet respect. "And I had advantages you never had: friends who trusted me, allies who shared the burden, and the knowledge that alternatives to force were possible." The conversation that followed was brief but profound, a meeting between past and present that acknowledged both continuity and growth. Tobirama's spirit offered final guidance about challenges that would face the reconstructed ninja world, while Naruto shared insights about leadership that had emerged from his unique experience of carrying 2 lifetimes of memory. The will of fire burns differently in each generation, Tobirama observed as his presence began to fade. But it burns brighter when it's shared rather than hoarded, when it serves bonds rather than institutions. As the spectral Hokage departed and the immediate aftermath of crisis gave way to longer-term planning, Naruto found himself surrounded by the friends and allies who had followed him through impossible circumstances. Sasuke stood beside him with the natural partnership that had finally transcended their competitive past. Sakura provided medical support with the expertise that had saved countless lives during the conflict. The other members of the allied forces represented unity that had seemed impossible before the war had forced them to work together. But perhaps the most significant presence was the absence of the crushing weight that had pressed against his consciousness since Tobirama's memories had first begun to surface. The internal struggle between inherited knowledge and personal values had resolved into synthesis rather than conflict. He was no longer fighting to maintain his identity against the influence of someone else's experiences. Instead, he had learned to draw strength from both sources while remaining fundamentally himself. The choice that would determine the future structure of the ninja world came not through dramatic proclamation, but through quiet conversations with leaders who had learned to trust his judgment. The reforms that had begun in Konoha would be extended to all villages, creating systems that prioritized cooperation over competition, understanding over suspicion. It wouldn't be easy, generations of mistrust and competition couldn't be overcome overnight. But the war had demonstrated that alternatives were possible, that people could choose connection over conflict when given the opportunity. As the sun set over the transformed Valley of the End, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Naruto carried with him the satisfaction of having honored both his inheritance and his nature. He had used Tobirama's knowledge and abilities in service of values that transcended either lifetime, creating outcomes that neither could have achieved alone. The will of fire burned bright within him, but it was a more complex flame now, one that honored the past while reaching toward a future where the mistakes of previous generations need not be repeated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the complex work of building lasting peace, the delicate process of implementing systemic reforms, the ongoing effort to maintain unity among people who had learned to work together under extreme circumstances. But tonight, there was the quiet satisfaction of having faced the ultimate test of leadership and emerged not just victorious, but fundamentally unchanged in the things that mattered most. The bonds with friends, the commitment to protecting others, the belief that understanding could triumph over force, all of it had survived the crucible of existential conflict. In the distance, representatives from all the major villages worked together to establish communication networks and coordination protocols that would support the peace they had all fought to achieve. The sight filled Naruto with hope that went beyond simple optimism to something approaching certainty. The cycle of hatred that had defined ninja history for generations was finally, truly breaking. And in its place, something better was being born, a world where power served connection rather than domination, where strength was measured not by what you could destroy, but by what you could preserve and protect. The war was over, but the most important victory was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site that had once been the Valley of the End, where workers from every major ninja village labored side by side to build something unprecedented in the history of the elemental nations. The massive complex taking shape among the transformed landscape would serve as headquarters for the newly established International Ninja Council, a governing body that represented the most ambitious attempt at lasting peace the ninja world had ever seen. Naruto stood on a temporary observation platform, reviewing architectural plans that combined Tobirama's systematic approach to governance with innovations that no previous generation had dared to imagine. The building itself was designed to embody the principles they were trying to establish: open layouts that encouraged collaboration, integrated communication systems that linked all major villages, and ceremonial spaces that honored every participating culture's traditions. The Mizukage's delegation arrived this morning, reported Shikamaru, approaching with the easy confidence that had developed during their months of coordinating post-war reconstruction. His role as administrative coordinator had evolved naturally from his analytical abilities, but also from his talent for translating Naruto's visionary concepts into practical implementation. Any concerns about the security protocols? Naruto asked, though his inherited knowledge of diplomatic procedures had already anticipated most potential issues. Nothing serious. They're impressed by the detection arrays you designed. Apparently the sensor network is more sophisticated than anything they've seen before. Shikamaru paused, studying the plans spread across Naruto's work table. Though they did ask how a 19-year-old developed such advanced understanding of international security architecture. The question was one that Naruto faced regularly now, though the political landscape had evolved enough that complete secrecy was no longer necessary. The revelation of his reincarnation had been handled carefully, shared with village leaders who needed to understand the source of his expertise while avoiding the kind of public disclosure that might create unrealistic expectations or dangerous precedents. The truth carefully presented, Naruto replied, echoing the approach they developed for managing sensitive information. Inherited knowledge from the second Hokage, applied with modern understanding and collaborative input from all participating villages. It was accurate without being overwhelming, acknowledging his unique situation while emphasizing that the innovations they were implementing represented collective effort rather than individual brilliance. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Gaara, whose transformation from isolated Jinchuriki to respected Kazekage had made him one of Naruto's most trusted partners in building the new international framework. His experience bridging the gap between individual trauma and public responsibility provided perspectives that complemented Naruto's own journey. The final votes are in, Gaara announced, his expression carrying satisfaction that went beyond simple political success. All 5 major villages have ratified the Mutual Defense and Cooperation Treaty. We're officially moving from wartime alliance to permanent partnership. The achievement represented months of complex negotiations that had required Naruto to balance inherited diplomatic knowledge with his own instinctive understanding of how to build trust between former enemies. Traditional treaty structures had been inadequate for the level of integration they were attempting, requiring innovations that drew on Tobirama's systematic thinking while transcending his limitations. Remarkable achievement, Tobirama's voice observed with something approaching amazement. International cooperation on this scale was considered impossible during my lifetime. The political framework simply didn't exist to support such extensive integration. But Naruto had learned that political frameworks could be created when people were motivated to make them work. The shared experience of facing existential threats had demonstrated that cooperation could achieve results that individual strength could never approach, creating momentum for changes that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. What about the academy integration programs? He asked, referring to one of the most ambitious aspects of their reconstruction efforts. Exceeding all projections, Gaara replied with evident satisfaction. Student exchange programs between villages are at capacity, and we're seeing collaborative innovations that none of the individual academies could have achieved alone. The educational reforms that had begun in Konoha were now being implemented across all participating villages, creating a generation of ninja who would grow up understanding cooperation as natural rather than exceptional. It was exactly the kind of long-term investment that Tobirama's strategic mind had always emphasized, but applied in service of unity rather than competitive advantage. As they reviewed the latest progress reports, Naruto felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple political success. The systems they were building would outlast any individual leader, creating frameworks that would support peaceful cooperation for generations to come. But the most significant development wasn't visible in organizational charts or diplomatic protocols. It was the gradual transformation of how people from different villages related to each other. Working relationships forged during the war had evolved into genuine friendships, professional partnerships that transcended traditional clan and village boundaries. There's something else we need to discuss, Shikamaru said, his tone shifting to carry the weight of a topic they'd been avoiding for weeks. The Hokage succession question. Naruto felt his chest tighten with familiar tension. Sunnade had announced her intention to step down once the international framework was fully established, and the village council had made clear their expectation that he would accept the position. But the decision carried implications that went far beyond personal preference. This is what all your preparation has been leading toward, Tobirama's voice observed with quiet certainty. The knowledge, the experience, the gradual integration of systematic thinking with idealistic values, all of it has been preparing you for the responsibilities of village leadership. But Naruto's own understanding of leadership had evolved beyond traditional models during his journey from inheriting Tobirama's memories to synthesizing them with his own values. The Hokage position represented ultimate responsibility for village welfare, but it also risked isolating him from the relationships and bonds that had always been his greatest strength. "I know what everyone expects," he said quietly, "but I'm not sure the traditional Hokage model is what Konoha needs anymore." Gaara and Shikamaru exchanged glances, understanding the complexity of his concerns. They'd watched him struggle with the balance between inherited knowledge and personal values, seen him develop approaches to leadership that transcended conventional categories. "Explain," Gaara said simply, his own experience with assuming leadership at a young age making him particularly attuned to the challenges involved. What followed was a conversation that touched on fundamental questions about governance, responsibility, and the relationship between individual identity and public service. Naruto outlined his vision for a modified leadership structure that would preserve the Hokage's authority while creating systems that prevented the isolation and burnout that had characterized previous holders of the position. "Distributed leadership," he explained, sketching organizational concepts on the planning documents. "Multiple people sharing responsibility for different aspects of village governance, with the Hokage serving as coordinator rather than sole decision-maker." Dangerous precedent, Tobirama's voice warned. "Divided authority creates opportunities for political manipulation and reduces decision-making efficiency during crisis situations." But Naruto's experience had taught him that crisis situations actually benefited from collaborative leadership when properly structured. The war had demonstrated that distributed responsibility could achieve better results than individual authority if coordinated effectively. "The council would never approve such a radical departure from tradition," Shikamaru pointed out, though his analytical mind was clearly intrigued by the possibilities. "They might if we can demonstrate that it serves village interests better than traditional approaches," Naruto replied. "And if we implement it gradually, building on systems that already exist rather than trying to revolutionize everything at once." The strategy was quintessentially Tobirama, systematic, gradual, designed to minimize resistance while achieving fundamental change. But the underlying vision was entirely Naruto's own, reflecting his understanding that effective leadership required preserving the bonds and connections that made governance meaningful. Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of Sasuke, whose role as head of the newly established Inter-Village Security Coordination Office had made him one of the most traveled people in the ninja world. His expression carried the focused intensity that marked important developments. "We have a situation," he announced without preamble. "Not a crisis, but an opportunity that requires immediate attention." What he described was a breakthrough in the research programs that had been established to study the long-term effects of the war's spiritual disruptions. Teams of scholars and ninja from multiple villages had been working to understand how the massive chakra manipulations had affected the fundamental relationship between spiritual energy and physical reality. "They've identified stable dimensional weak points," Sasuke continued, his voice carrying excitement that was rare for him. "Locations where the barriers between dimensions remain permeable in ways that could be beneficial rather than dangerous." The implications were staggering. If properly developed, such locations could serve as research facilities for advancing techniques that served peaceful purposes, training grounds that would allow ninja to develop abilities that transcended traditional limitations, even communication networks that connected the ninja world more effectively than anything previously imagined. But the opportunities came with responsibilities that required careful consideration. The power to manipulate dimensional boundaries was exactly the kind of capability that could be used for conquest as easily as cooperation, requiring governance structures that could manage such resources responsibly. "This is what leadership during periods of rapid change actually means," Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto processed the implications. "Not just maintaining existing systems, but developing new frameworks to handle capabilities that didn't exist when those systems were created. We'll need international oversight," Naruto decided after considering the various factors involved. "Research protocols that ensure discoveries benefit everyone rather than giving advantages to individual villages." It was exactly the kind of decision that the International Ninja Council had been designed to handle, complex issues that transcended individual village interests and required collaborative solutions. The framework they'd been building would face its first major test sooner than anticipated. The meeting that followed involved representatives from all major villages, along with scholars and technical experts who understood both the opportunities and risks involved. Naruto found himself drawing on every aspect of his inherited knowledge, while remaining true to the collaborative principles that had guided their post-war reconstruction. Fascinating synthesis, Tobirama's voice observed as the discussions progressed. You're using systematic analytical approaches to support idealistic objectives rather than treating them as opposing forces. The result is more effective than either approach could achieve independently. The observation marked a crucial understanding about how Naruto had evolved since first inheriting Tobirama's memories. Instead of choosing between inherited knowledge and personal values, he'd learned to use each in service of the other, creating approaches that honored both effectiveness and idealism. By the time the session concluded, they had established research protocols that would allow systematic development of dimensional manipulation techniques while ensuring that discoveries served peaceful cooperation rather than competitive advantage. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the international framework could handle complex challenges effectively. But the most significant outcome was the realization that Naruto's leadership style had finally reached full maturity. He was no longer fighting to balance competing aspects of his nature. He was consciously choosing which elements to emphasize in different situations, guided by principles that transcended either lifetime. "You found your answer about the Hokage position, haven't you?" Sasuke observed as they walked back toward the village that evening. Naruto nodded, understanding that his friend's perceptive nature had recognized the shift that had occurred during the day's discussions. "I'll accept the position, but on terms that reflect what we've learned about effective leadership. Conditions, collaborative governance structures that prevent isolation and burnout. Regular rotation of responsibilities that keeps leaders connected to the people they serve. International coordination protocols that ensure village decisions serve larger peaceful purposes." Naruto paused, considering the synthesis of inherited knowledge and personal values that would guide his tenure. Basically, using the authority of the position to demonstrate that leadership can serve bonds rather than replacing them. The conversation that followed covered practical details about implementation timelines and political procedures, but also touched on deeper questions about identity and purpose that had shaped both their journeys. Sasuke's experience rebuilding his clan's reputation provided perspectives that complemented Naruto's struggles with inherited responsibility. "The thing I've learned," Sasuke said as they approached the village gates, "is that carrying someone else's legacy doesn't mean becoming them. It means using their knowledge to build something better than either of you could have achieved alone." The insight captured something essential about Naruto's transformation over the past months. He had stopped fighting against Tobirama's influence and started using it as a foundation for innovations that neither lifetime could have produced independently. As they entered Konoha proper, passing through streets that hummed with reconstruction activity and international collaboration, Naruto felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. The village he would soon lead was stronger than the one Tobirama had known, more unified, more connected to the larger ninja world, more capable of adapting to challenges that previous generations could never have imagined. The formal ceremony accepting the Hokage position took place 3 days later, in the newly constructed Great Hall that served as the centerpiece of Konoha's redesigned government district. Representatives from all major villages attended, along with citizens whose lives had been shaped by the reforms that Naruto had helped implement. But the most meaningful moment came when the spectral presence of previous Hokage manifested to witness the transfer of authority. Tobirama's spirit appeared alongside Hashirama, Hiruzen, and Minato, creating a connection between past and present that transcended individual lifetimes. "You have achieved something none of us managed," Tobirama's spirit said, his voice carrying approval that went beyond simple tactical assessment. "You have learned to use inherited wisdom in service of values that transform rather than preserve existing limitations." "I learned from your mistakes," Naruto replied with quiet respect. "And I had advantages you never had: friends who trusted me, allies who shared the burden, and the knowledge that alternatives to traditional approaches were possible." The conversation that followed was brief but profound, a meeting between past and future that acknowledged both continuity and growth. Each previous Hokage offered guidance about challenges that would face the reconstructed ninja world, while Naruto shared insights about leadership that had emerged from his unique experience. "The will of fire burns differently in each generation," Hashirama observed as the spectral presences began to fade. "But it burns brightest when it serves connection rather than control, when it builds bridges rather than walls." As the ceremony concluded and the immediate celebration gave way to longer-term planning, Naruto found himself in his new office, redesigned to emphasize collaboration rather than isolation. With open layouts that encouraged consultation and communication systems that linked him directly to all aspects of village governance. The first policy he implemented was exactly what he'd promised: a distributed leadership structure that shared responsibility while maintaining clear lines of authority. The cabinet he assembled included people from multiple generations and backgrounds, creating decision-making processes that combined experience with innovation. But perhaps the most significant change was symbolic rather than structural. Instead of the traditional hat that isolated the Hokage behind formal authority, Naruto chose to wear a modified version that incorporated elements representing all the villages that participated in the International Ninja Council. The message was clear: this Hokage would serve not just Konoha's interests, but the larger peaceful cooperation that all their efforts had been building toward. As the sun set over the village he now led officially as well as practically, Naruto carried with him the satisfaction of having honored both his inheritance and his nature. He had used Tobirama's knowledge and abilities in service of values that transcended either lifetime, creating outcomes that neither could have achieved alone. The will of fire burned bright within him, but it was a more complex flame now, one that honored the past while reaching toward a future where the mistakes of previous generations need not be repeated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the complex work of maintaining peace, the delicate process of implementing systemic reforms, the ongoing effort to demonstrate that cooperation could be more effective than competition. But tonight, there was the quiet satisfaction of having built something lasting. The frameworks they had established would outlast any individual leader, creating structures that would support peaceful collaboration for generations to come. In the distance, lights from all the major villages flickered like earthbound stars, connected by communication networks and cooperation agreements that made them partners rather than rivals. The sight filled Naruto with hope that went beyond simple optimism to something approaching certainty. The cycle of hatred that had defined ninja history for generations was finally, truly broken. And in its place, something better had been born: a world where power served connection rather than domination, where strength was measured not by what you could destroy, but by what you could preserve and protect. The most important victory was no longer beginning, it was becoming the foundation for everything that would follow. And in that understanding, Naruto found the peace that had eluded both his current self and his previous incarnation, the knowledge that some legacies were meant to be transformed rather than simply inherited. The will of fire would continue to burn, carried by those who had learned that the greatest strength lay not in the techniques they mastered, but in the wisdom to use them in service of bonds that transcended individual lifetimes. 5 years had passed since the formal establishment of the International Ninja Council, and the world that emerged from the ashes of the Fourth Great Ninja War bore little resemblance to the fractured landscape of competing villages that had defined ninja history for generations. The morning sun cast gentle light across Konoha's redesigned streets, where children from multiple clans played together without the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable, their laughter carrying the promise of a future built on cooperation rather than suspicion. Naruto stood at the window of his office in the Hokage Tower, watching the daily rhythm of a village that had become something unprecedented. Not just a military installation designed for defense and projection of power, but a genuine community that served as a model for the peaceful integration he'd spent years working to achieve. The view before him represented the successful synthesis of Tobirama's systematic approach to governance, with his own instinctive understanding of what made bonds between people meaningful. "The Chunin exam reports are ready for your review," announced Shizune as she entered with a stack of documents that would have seemed overwhelming to the old Naruto, but which his enhanced analytical abilities could process with comfortable efficiency. "How are our international participants performing?" he asked, accepting the reports while maintaining his observation of the street scene below. "Exceptionally well," she replied with evident satisfaction. "The collaborative training programs have produced a generation of ninja whose tactical sophistication and cooperative abilities exceed anything we've seen before. More importantly, they're forming genuine friendships across village lines that should prevent the kind of mistrust that led to previous conflicts." The achievement represented everything Naruto had been working toward since first inheriting Tobirama's memories. The educational reforms that had begun as experiments in Konoha were now standard practice across all major villages, creating young ninja who understood collaboration as natural rather than exceptional. "Remarkable success," Tobirama's voice observed with something approaching amazement. The systematic integration of clan specializations with intervillage cooperation has produced strategic capabilities that neither individual villages nor traditional alliances could have achieved. But what satisfied Naruto most wasn't the tactical advantages. It was the sight of young ninja from formerly hostile villages working together with the easy partnership that had once seemed impossible. The bonds being formed in training grounds and academies would shape diplomatic relationships for decades to come. His review of the examination results was interrupted by the arrival of Sasuke, whose role as director of intervillage security had evolved into something approaching diplomatic ambassador. His travels between villages had given him perspectives on the broader changes taking place across the ninja world, making his insights invaluable for long-term strategic planning. "Interesting development from the land of Earth," Sasuke announced, settling into the chair across from Naruto's desk with the comfortable familiarity that had replaced their old competitive dynamic. "The Tsuchikage wants to discuss expanding the dimensional research programs we established." The research initiatives that had grown from their discovery of stable dimensional weak points had become one of the most successful aspects of their international cooperation, producing innovations in communication, transportation, and even medical techniques that served peaceful purposes rather than military advantage. "Specific proposals?" Naruto asked, though his enhanced analytical abilities were already processing implications and potential complications. "Joint research facilities that would be truly international, not just cooperation between existing village programs, but integrated teams that transcend traditional boundaries entirely." Sasuke paused, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood both opportunities and risks. The kind of integration that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. It was exactly the natural evolution that Naruto had hoped for when they'd first established the international framework. Cooperation that began as practical necessity was developing into genuine partnership, creating momentum for changes that went beyond what any individual leader could have mandated. Classic progressive integration, Tobirama's analytical mind noted with approval. Establish functional cooperation first, then allow success to create demand for deeper collaboration. The approach minimizes resistance while maximizing long-term systemic change. But Naruto's satisfaction went beyond strategic success to personal fulfillment. The world they were building honored both efficiency and idealism, demonstrating that systematic thinking could serve humanitarian values when applied with sufficient wisdom and patience. Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of a group that made Naruto's chest swell with pride. His first class of personal students, now approaching graduation from the advanced training program he developed. The 4 young ninja represented everything he'd been working to achieve. Diverse backgrounds united by shared values, individual specializations enhanced by collaborative training, and the kind of bonds that transcended clan and village affiliations. Sensei announced Konohamaru, whose growth from the hyperactive child Naruto remembered into a capable young leader had been one of his greatest personal satisfactions. "We've completed the joint mission simulation with the Cloud Village teams." The exercise they were referring to was one of Naruto's innovations, training scenarios that required coordination between ninja from different villages. Designed to build the practical experience and personal relationships that would support long-term peace. "Results?" Naruto asked, though the confident expressions on his students' faces already suggested success. "Perfect coordination," replied Mogi, the analytical precision she developed complementing Konohamaru's natural leadership abilities. "The integration protocols you taught us worked exactly as designed, and we completed the mission objectives ahead of schedule." More importantly, added Udon, whose strategic thinking had flourished under Naruto's guidance. "We've established working relationships with the Cloud teams that should continue beyond the training program." It was exactly what Naruto had hoped to hear, not just tactical success, but the formation of bonds that would outlast individual missions or political arrangements. The next generation was developing the personal connections that would make future conflicts unnecessary rather than just unlikely. "This is what effective leadership legacy actually means," Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto watched his students interact with easy friendship. "Not just institutional changes that preserve your policies, but fundamental shifts in how people relate to each other that transcend individual leadership tenures." But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Hanabi Hyuga, the youngest member of his student team and someone whose clan background had once made her suspicious of outsiders, spoke up with quiet confidence. "Sensei, the Hyuga elders want to formally adopt the collaborative training methods for our clan's advanced courses." she announced. They've seen the results we're achieving and want to expand the program to include other bloodline families. The development represented a breakthrough that Naruto had hardly dared to hope for. The Hyuga had been among the most traditional and insular of Konoha's clans. Their adoption of collaborative methods would signal that even the most conservative elements of ninja society were embracing the changes they'd been working to implement. "Excellent progress, all of you," Naruto said, his voice carrying the warmth that had always characterized his relationships with students. "You've demonstrated that the bonds between people can transcend any barrier if approached with patience and genuine care." As his students departed to prepare for their final examinations, Naruto found himself reflecting on how much had changed since he'd first begun inheriting Tobirama's memories. The struggle to balance analytical thinking with emotional connections had resolved into synthesis, creating an approach to leadership that honored both effectiveness and idealism. The afternoon brought a different kind of validation, a meeting with representatives from all the major villages to review the 5-year progress of their international cooperation initiatives. The gathering would have been impossible under previous diplomatic structures, but had become routine under the frameworks they'd established. "The statistical analysis is clear," announced Temari, whose role as diplomatic coordinator for the Sand Village had made her one of Naruto's most trusted collaborators. "Intervillage conflicts are down 89% compared to pre-war levels. Economic cooperation has increased prosperity across all participating regions. And perhaps most importantly, public support for the international framework has remained consistently high." The data was impressive, but Naruto's satisfaction came from understanding what those numbers represented. Families that remained intact instead of being destroyed by conflict, young ninja who could focus on development rather than survival, communities that could invest in growth rather than defense. "Exceptional achievement," Tobirama's voice confirmed with something approaching awe. "The systematic coordination of political, economic, and military cooperation has created stability that exceeds the most optimistic projections from my era." But the most significant moment of the meeting came when the youngest representative, a recently appointed advisor from the Mist Village who had grown up entirely within the cooperative framework they'd established, asked a question that crystallized everything they'd been working toward. "Hokage Uzumaki," she said with the respectful curiosity that marked her generation's approach to learning, "my grandmother remembers when villages viewed each other as permanent enemies. How did you convince people that cooperation was possible when conflict had seemed inevitable for so long?" The question touched on the heart of everything Naruto had learned during his journey from isolated Jinchuriki to leader who carried the memories of 2 lifetimes. His answer drew on both inherited wisdom and personal experience, but more importantly, on the understanding that had emerged from synthesizing both perspectives. "I didn't convince anyone," he replied thoughtfully. "Instead, we created opportunities for people to discover that cooperation served their interests better than conflict. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not through argument, but through experience." The insight reflected his mature understanding of how systematic change occurred, not through force or manipulation, but through patient demonstration that alternatives to traditional approaches could achieve better results while serving higher values. As the meeting concluded and representatives departed to carry news of continued success back to their respective villages, Naruto found himself alone with the weight of accomplishment that went beyond personal achievement to something approaching historical significance. The transformation of the ninja world had been possible because of the unique combination of inherited knowledge and personal values that his reincarnation had made available. But more importantly, it had been sustained by the willingness of countless individuals to embrace changes that served bonds rather than power. "You have achieved something that neither of us could have accomplished independently," Tobirama's voice observed as Naruto prepared to leave the office for his evening routine. The synthesis of systematic thinking with idealistic values has created outcomes that transcend the limitations of either approach. But even as he accepted the acknowledgement, Naruto understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the policies he'd implemented or the institutions he'd established. It was the demonstration that leadership could serve connections rather than replacing them, that power could strengthen bonds rather than undermining them. The evening brought his favorite part of each day, time spent with the people who had shaped his journey from the beginning. Sasuke joined him for their regular training session, their partnership now characterized by the easy cooperation that had replaced competitive rivalry. Sakura provided updates on the medical exchange programs that were spreading advanced techniques across all villages while building professional relationships that transcended political boundaries. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during his weekly visit to the Memorial Stone, where he could reflect on how far they'd all come since the days when loss had seemed like the inevitable price of ninja life. "You would be proud of what we've built," he said quietly, addressing the names carved into the stone's surface. Not just the individual people he'd known and lost, but the entire generation that had sacrificed so much to make their current peace possible. The response came not in words, but in the spiritual presence he could still feel: Tobirama's consciousness, now fully integrated rather than competing for control, offering the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had finally achieved its intended purpose. The will of fire burns differently in each generation, the presence whispered with contentment that transcended individual identity. But it burns brightest when it serves the future rather than preserving the past. As he made his way home through streets that hummed with peaceful activity and international cooperation, Naruto carried with him the understanding that his greatest victory had been learning to honor his inheritance while remaining true to his own nature. The village around him represented the successful synthesis of Tobirama's systematic brilliance with his own intuitive grasp of what made life meaningful. Young ninja from multiple clans and villages trained together with natural partnership, their abilities enhanced by collaborative techniques that no individual tradition could have developed alone. But the most profound change wasn't visible in organizational charts or diplomatic agreements. It was the fundamental shift in how people related to each other. The suspicion and mistrust that had characterized inter-village relationships for generations had been replaced by curiosity and cooperation. The realization that this transformation would outlast his own tenure as Hokage filled Naruto with quiet satisfaction. The frameworks they'd established would continue to evolve, guided by principles that served bonds rather than power, adapted by leaders who had grown up understanding cooperation as natural rather than exceptional. This is what effective legacy means, he thought as he reached his home, where Hinata waited with the gentle strength that had anchored him throughout his most challenging periods of growth. Not preserving specific policies or institutions, but establishing principles that allow future generations to build something even better. The conversation over dinner touched on practical matters: upcoming diplomatic initiatives, training program developments, family plans that reflected their confidence in the peaceful future they'd helped create. But underlying all of it was the shared understanding that they were living in a world that honored both individual dreams and collective welfare. Later that evening, as Naruto sat in his study reviewing reports and planning for initiatives that would extend their success into the next decade, he felt the presence that had shaped his journey beginning to fade. Not disappearing, but integrating so completely that the boundary between inherited knowledge and personal wisdom had become meaningless. "Your work is complete," Tobirama's voice whispered with finality. "The village is secure, the frameworks are stable, and the next generation is prepared to build on what we've established. You no longer need guidance from the past, you've become someone capable of shaping the future on your own terms." But even as the presence faded, Naruto understood that he would always carry the lessons learned from integrating 2 lifetimes of experience. The analytical thinking that had once felt foreign now served his natural compassion. The strategic planning that had seemed cold now supported the warm connections that made life meaningful. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing both his predecessor and his own journey of growth, "for teaching me that leadership doesn't require choosing between effectiveness and idealism. It requires finding ways to make them serve each other." The response came not in words, but in a sense of completion that went beyond individual satisfaction to something approaching cosmic rightness. The cycle that had begun with Tobirama's unfinished work had been completed, but transformed in ways that honored both past achievements and future possibilities. As he prepared for sleep, Naruto looked out his window at the village that had become something unprecedented in ninja history. A community that combined military effectiveness with genuine care for all its inhabitants, individual excellence with collaborative achievement, traditional values with progressive innovation. The lights flickering in windows throughout the village represented lives that were fuller and safer, because of the choices made by people who had learned to see beyond the limitations of previous generations. Children who would grow up taking cooperation for granted, adults who had discovered that their individual strengths could be amplified through partnership with others, elders who had lived to see the conflicts of their youth transformed into the foundations for lasting peace. The will of fire burns eternal, Naruto thought as he settled into sleep, but it burns brightest when it serves bonds that transcend individual lifetimes. In his dreams that night, he saw glimpses of the future that would grow from the foundations they'd established. Innovations that combined techniques from multiple villages, diplomatic solutions that prevented conflicts before they could develop, young ninja who would carry forward the understanding that power served best when it strengthened rather than dominated. But perhaps the most satisfying vision was simpler. Children playing together in training grounds that had once been battlefields, their laughter carrying the promise that some cycles could be broken, that some legacies could be transformed rather than simply inherited. When he woke the next morning, Naruto carried with him the quiet confidence of someone who had successfully integrated the wisdom of the past with the hopes of the future. The struggle to balance competing aspects of his nature had resolved into synthesis, creating an approach to life that honored both inherited knowledge and personal values. The village that awakened around him was stronger, more unified, and more hopeful than anything previous generations had dared to imagine. The frameworks they'd established would continue to evolve, guided by principles that served connections rather than control, adapted by leaders who understood that the greatest strength came from empowering others rather than hoarding power. This is what it means to carry the will of fire forward, Naruto realized as he prepared for another day of leadership and service. Not preserving the past unchanged, but using its lessons to build something better for the future. The sun rose over Konoha like a promise, its light illuminating streets where former enemies worked as partners, training grounds where collaboration had replaced competition, and faces that carried the contentment of people who had learned to trust in something larger than individual strength. In that light, Naruto saw the reflection of everything he had become, not just the inheritor of Tobirama's knowledge, but the architect of a future that honored both efficiency and idealism, both systematic thinking and emotional wisdom, both the lessons of the past and the hopes of generations yet to come. The will of fire burned bright within him, but it was a flame shared with countless others now, carried by friends who had become family, students who had become teachers in their own right, and communities that had learned to see strength in diversity rather than uniformity. As he stepped out into the morning to begin another day of building the future, Naruto carried with him the understanding that the greatest victories were not won through conflict, but through the patient work of making alternatives to conflict both possible and preferable. Behind him, the village stirred to life with the confident energy of a community that had learned to combine individual excellence with collaborative achievement. Ahead of him lay challenges that would require continued wisdom and adaptation, but also opportunities to demonstrate that the bonds forged in peace could be stronger than any weapon forged in war. The story that had begun with a young ninja inheriting memories he didn't understand had become something larger, the tale of how one generation's willingness to learn from the past, while remaining true to their own values, had transformed the foundations of their world. And in that transformation, the will of fire found its truest expression, not as the property of any single village or leader, but as the shared flame that burns whenever people choose understanding over suspicion, cooperation over competition, and hope over fear. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and anchored by wisdom. And Naruto Uzumaki, 7th Hokage of Konoha and inheritor of 2 lifetimes worth of experience, walked into that future with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the greatest legacy was not the techniques you mastered, but the lives you touched and the bonds you helped forge. The will of fire would continue to burn, carried by those who understood that some flames grew brighter when shared rather than hoarded, stronger when they served others rather than the self, and eternal when they embodied the understanding that true power lay not in what you could take, but in what you chose to give. In the end, that was the lesson both Naruto and Tobirama had needed to learn, that leadership at its finest was not about control, but about connection, not about domination, but about service. Not about preserving the past unchanged, but about honoring its lessons while building something worthy of the future. And in that lesson, the cycle was complete, but the story, the greatest story, of people learning to transcend their limitations through bonds that honored both individual worth and collective welfare, would continue as long as there were those willing to carry the flame forward. The will of fire burned on, eternal and ever-changing, a light that would guide generations yet to come toward possibilities that even 2 lifetimes of wisdom had only begun to imagine. And that's how Naruto went from hyperactive genin to the Hokage who transformed the entire ninja world using 2 lifetimes of wisdom. What was your favorite moment? The first flying thunder god, the Payne fight, or that epic Kaguya confrontation? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe for more insane Naruto what-if scenarios and let me know what crazy concepts you want next. Peace out.